So friends, we gonna see what if Naruto goes rogue with Kurama movie. Multitudes of green leaves rustled together, and skinny brown twigs split in two as Naruto furiously shoved aside a network of green branches, forcing his way through the brush. Every branch shoved aside forged the path forward, and as he neared the end of the brush, a beam of light illuminated the right side of his face. There it was. The light at the end of the tunnel. The web of branches at the end of the brush split with a final shove, and out rolled Naruto, who unfortunately took a face full of dirt instead of sticking the landing. The momentum of his legs almost sent him into a flip, but they hovered above him for a moment before crashing back into the ground. A groan of pain echoed from his lips as he sputtered out a mouthful of dirt and shakily rose to his feet, casting a weary glance behind him. Different green trees and shrubbery were the only things that fell on his eyes. A very good thing considering how persistent the ninja following him was. Maybe had lost them. His chest rose and fell as the exhaustion of the fight started to take its toll. Adrenaline had been his friend at the start of this encounter, but now it was wearing off. Just my luck, he said, breathing raggedly, fighting some weird ninja in the middle of the forest. That weird ninja, Kurama emphasized, is currently responsible for those gashes across your upper body. Yeah, Naruto said, grimacing as he examined the deep gashes lining his upper body. The ragged wounds were oozing blood at an alarming rate, and it was now to the point where the upper portion of his outfit was soaked in blood and looked more red than orange. Groaning, he tore his eyes away, looking to the forest to try to calm his mind. It didn't work though, it only fueled his dread. He still hadn't caught a glimpse of who was chasing him, and looking into the mix of greens and browns while standing in eerie silence was beyond unnerving. Finally, he shut his eyes, taking a breath. His voice came out silent and shakier than intended. Think he's the guy Mayumi was talking about? Kurama paused, an uneasy silence passing between the two. I don't know, he replied silently, but whoever he is, he's resourceful. Yeah, what gave it away? The giant hawk or the rabid dog? Joke all you want, but he's obviously skilled, and if he's who we think he is, it's even worse than that. Yeah, definitely worse, Naruto breathed, lips barely moving as he nearly fell out of consciousness. The pain was pulsating from every gash, and it was getting to be unbearable. The only thing that seemed to help was when he shut his eyes. He would give the world right now if it meant just a few minutes of sleep, but instead, he was greeted with shivers. His body felt like an uncontrollable mess of nerves, and it didn't take long to realize that fighting the shivers was no use. He was going into shock. Within seconds, his breathing rate had increased, and every breath felt like it was being pulled through a filter. A very dirty and clogged one at that. You all right? The fox asked. What? Naruto said, straightening up to gather what little strength he had left. You getting sleepy? Well, at least you've still got your sense of humor. Naruto chuckled, then steeled himself, balling up both fists and taking a deep breath. After he had recollected himself, he said, if we've got someone this powerful on our tail, then we're almost in the clear. We've just gotta keep pushing. All right, kid, let's see if you've got what it takes. You better believe it, Naruto replied, turning his attention to the forest ahead. With a squint, he eyed the closest tree and leapt up to the nearest branch. No fear, no pain, no tears, just the will to press on and the knowledge that it would be worth it in the end. Naruto Uzumaki wasn't always a rogue, like everyone. He was once a child, and like any child, he had hopes, dreams, and aspirations, but the world he grew up in was unkind to him. Years of abuse and neglect were heaped onto his shoulders, and, over time, he came to accept that the way people treated him was a burden he had no choice but to carry. Sometimes, the thought of being a runaway would cross his mind, but these thoughts were usually pushed into the recesses of his mind as foolish. Where would he go? Konoha was his home. It was all he knew, and it was probably all he would ever know. Still, the thought never quite made its way out of that thick skull of his. He could never forget the first time that thought crossed his mind. It was on his first day at the academy. Dull kunai blades clanged against each other as a group of schoolboys played outside during lunch break. They all looked to be in some faraway land, carefree, unburdened, joyful. All Naruto could do was look on with blue eyes sparkling in wonder. The genuine laughter tickled his ears as the children traded blows and hurled fierce battle cries at each other. It was a kid's paradise in every sense of the word. Naruto let out a deep breath, then left his place on the swing and started his sprint towards the spirited playground. His kunai was already firmly lodged under his fingers, and a determined smile could be seen on his lips as he launched himself into the middle of the playful skirmish. His eyes brimmed with excitement as he landed in front of one of the schoolboys and energetically dropped into his battle stance. Time seemed to slow to a halt as Naruto waited for the boy to respond, but it didn't take long for him to realize that he was waiting in vain. The boy never responded, and as Naruto looked around, he noticed that it wasn't only the boy in front of him. All around, the joyful sounds surrounding the lively playground had died down and, one by one, the other boys had turned to look at him. Some of them looked at him like he was a rain cloud on a sunny day, and others settled for an uncomfortable glance in his direction. The grin Naruto had been wearing slowly faded as he noticed he was now the only one in a fighting stance. If the rejection and shame showing on everyone's faces didn't kill him, the nasty stares they sent his way would do the job. His eyes landed on a skinny kid with spiky red hair who was now walking towards him. He could hear the words on his tongue before they left his lips: "Get lost." "But why can't I play?" Naruto asked, a stubborn pout crossing his face. "Loser." A random voice called out. The spiky red-haired kid sighed, then said, "Sorry, real ninjas only." "But I am a real ninja. We're both in the academy, remember?" "Getting into the academy doesn't make you a real ninja." "Then what does?" The spiky-haired kid used his index finger to scratch the side of his cheek as he thought about it. "Well," he said, looking down on Naruto, "real ninjas have to be a certain height. Yeah, that's it, you're too short." "What?" Naruto yelled. "But what about that kid?" he said, pointing an accusing finger at one of the boys. "He's chubby and about a foot shorter than me." "Oh," the spiky-haired kid replied, examining the boy who had been accused. After a moment of thinking, he lifted a spiny finger pointed towards the tallest boy in the group, and said, "Well, his brother is tall enough for both of them. Now get out of here." Naruto gritted his teeth and balled his fists until his knuckles were white. What a lame excuse. The worst part was that there was nothing he could do about it. By now, he knew that this was just how things were. He stared down the spiky-haired kid for a while, then shoved his hands into his pockets and walked away. He left with a lot of anger showing on his face, and even more of it hidden in his heart. But as angry as he was, he didn't throw a tantrum, neither did he cry. Doing any of those things would just make them think they were getting to him, and that was something he would never let them see. So, no matter how much he hurt on the inside, he promised himself one thing: he would take it. Shikamaru was leaning against the wall of the academy with both arms crossed and couldn't tear his lazy eyes from the spectacle. The Naru's sharp eyes lingered on Naruto until he had made his way back to the swing. After a while, Shikamaru turned his attention back to a shogi piece he had been fidgeting between his fingers. A sigh escaped his lips as he spoke to his wide-bodied companion. They couldn't even give him a break on the first day of school. Choji was leaning against the wall just a few inches away with one hand halfway down a chip bag. The solemn look on his face revealed that he didn't know what to say. In the end, he simply whispered, "No, doesn't look like it." Sakura's eyes were usually a vibrant green, but their usual brightness faded as she watched the ordeal from under the shade of the academy building. "Do you know?" she asked, staring sadly at the scene. "Know what?" replied a curious Ino. "What makes people hate him so much?" Ino cast a glance towards Naruto, then gave a disheartened shrug and softly said, "No." As Naruto sat on the swing, a silent thud fell on his ears. A glance behind him revealed the stoic form of Sasuke Uchiha, darkened by the shade of the tree. Naruto only knew who he was because everyone had to introduce themselves on the first day of class, but it was already obvious that he was one of those serious types. The two stared at each other for a bit longer. Then Naruto crossed his arms. "Well, what are you looking at?" he half yelled. Sasuke's hands fell into his pockets as he turned and started walking away. His footsteps faded into the background, but before he fell out of earshot, Naruto heard him mutter 3 words, "Grow up, loser." Naruto watched Sasuke's retreating form for a moment before lowering his eyes and returning to his original position on the swing. "Jerk," he mumbled, wiping away a sniffle with his forearm. Later that day, Naruto found himself sitting at one of the stools of Ichiraku Ramen with a piping hot bowl of ramen steaming in front of him. The thin chopsticks twirled in his fingers as he slowly stirred the meal. He assumed it was obvious he was having a bad day because Tucci told him his bowl was on the house and Ayame added an extra helping of pork to the bowl. There was no doubt that the kind gesture had brightened up his day. But it wasn't enough to shake earlier events from his mind. Ichiraku's had turned into a place of comfort for him over the years, but the sight of empty seats every time he came to eat just reminded him that he didn't really have anybody. There were a few days here and there when Iruka would treat him to a few bowls, but the gloomy days when he had to eat alone far outweighed the brighter days. He wanted more. Maybe that was selfish of him, or maybe it was normal. Whatever it was, that was the first time he felt it. What if he ran away? Naruto sat on the familiar playground swing, rocking back and forth as he looked on at the other kids enjoying themselves a few dozen feet away. The swing felt the same way it always felt. The wooden base was uncomfortable and hard, and the brown ropes holding it up were rough enough to callous your hands if you gripped too hard. But worst of all, the seat was lonely. He always sat there watching all the other kids play. But no matter what he did, there was always some reason to leave him out. It had been 2 years since Connie made up that stupid height requirement rule. But now that Naruto had grown a few inches taller, Connie told him that he also needed to be skilled enough to beat him in a spar. No one else had to beat Connie in a fight to be a part of the group, but Naruto did. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he accepted it. He promised himself that he would beat that jerk one day and earn his place with everyone else. Today would be that day. He had failed in the past, but after a few months of training, he was sure he could do it. The wooden swing lurched in the opposite direction as Naruto jumped to his feet and marched up to where the other kids were playing. He squatted down into his usual fighting stance with his kunai in hand, digging his foot into the dirt to secure his footing. Connie sighed, then gave Naruto an almost sad look while spinning his kunai into his hand as usual. The playground was already starting to fill with cheers from most of the other kids, and before long, a small circle of cheering children had formed around the two. Put him in his place, Connie. Yeah, get him. Naruto and Connie were now both in their fighting stances and carefully eyeing each other from opposite edges of the circle. Each of the fighters had one hand firmly gripping a kunai just inches from their bodies, and their steps were barely audible as they slowly stalked the edge of the makeshift arena. Naruto eyed his opponent, then let out a steadying breath to slow his breathing. For some reason, the air felt stuffy now and it was harder to breathe. It was a familiar feeling. Maybe there was more dust in the air than usual. He forced himself to focus and blocked out all of the cheers until they faded into the background. The only sound he heard now was that of his own heartbeat. It was a steady 2-beat thumping sound. It grew louder with each passing second. Messy red hair blitzed towards Naruto and his grip on his kunai tightened. A streak of silver was all Naruto saw as Kane's kunai came dangerously close to tearing right through his chest. He slid his right foot against the dirt just in time to lean back and avoid the blow. But Kane's onslaught continued. The kunai spun around in Kane's hand as he tried jabbing at Naruto from above, below, and every angle in between. Defensive blocks and sidesteps were all Naruto had to offer. Every swipe, blow, or kick from Connie was so aggressive that Naruto couldn't find a spot to land a single blow of his own. In past attempts, he had tried waiting for an opening, but that method had proved unfruitful. It was infuriating. What he needed was to find some way to land a punch, despite Kane's onslaught. He waited until Connie launched a one-legged kick, then rushed forward trying to force a hit, but the only thing he felt on the end of his elbow was a cool breeze. All of that energy had connected with absolutely nothing. As his elbow flew towards empty space, he realized his mistake and tried to recover. But it was too late. That single moment was all Connie needed to disarm him, and without even realizing how it happened, Naruto found himself slammed to the ground with the cool blade of a kunai pressed against his neck. As the cool dirt rubbed against his face, he found himself struggling under the weight of Kane's knee. It was no use, and the position his body was in confirmed what his mind already knew. He was beaten. The violent writhing under Kane's knee slowed to a stop and Naruto shut his eyes, letting his body fall slack. Connie spun his kunai into his pouch, then lifted his knee from Naruto's back as he rose to his feet. Cheers once again echoed from the crowd of children and a few insults were mingled in for good measure. The taunts fell on deaf ears. Naruto had heard all of the insults before, and tuning people out was a well-developed skill of his. As he started pushing off the ground to get up, he felt a hand grab under his shoulder to help him up. "Leave him alone," Connie said, helping Naruto off the ground. "He might be a loser." Connie paused, taking a moment to brush some of the dust from Naruto's orange tracksuit, then said, "But he's a determined one." A baffled Naruto cast his gaze to Connie and saw that there was no hint of teasing on his face. He meant exactly what he had said. A determined loser. Volleys of insults had assaulted Naruto's ears before, but never before had someone actually complimented him. To be honest, it wasn't even a full compliment, but did that really matter? Naruto spent the rest of the day trying to figure out the answer to that question. In the end, he concluded that it didn't. Being a determined loser was better than being a flat-out loser any day, so he was going to take this small mercy and hold on to it as tightly as he could. That year at the academy, Naruto finally started to feel like he fit in somewhat. Before that year had ended, he had a small circle of people he could call friends. They included people like Shikamaru Nara, Choji Akamichi, and another boy named Kiba Inuzuka. With time, a few more kids warmed up to him, although most remained somewhat hostile. Most of those who associated with him affectionately called him the funny loser. Considering how people had treated him before, he couldn't complain. Being a funny loser was an improvement. By his final year, he had graduated from funny loser to class clown. The variety of pranks he pulled not only got him the acknowledgement he desired but also resulted in the complete removal of the loser moniker he seemed to be stuck with. If he was honest, he didn't quite like the title of class clown, but it didn't have loser attached to it, so he couldn't complain. As graduation time neared, Naruto couldn't help but feel like there was some distance forming between him and the academy. The classrooms started to feel like part of an eternal genjutsu that he couldn't escape. Everything was the same. Teachers gripped chalk to scribble lessons on boards and expected children to follow along, take notes, and learn. Groups of kids formed mini-tribes while others, like Sasuke, kept to themselves. To put it short, every day consisted of going to the same stuffy classrooms, seeing the same familiar, and sometimes hostile, faces, and living the same drab life. He couldn't wait for the day when he became a genin. That day seemed to come at a snail's pace, but he strengthened his mind and endured. The hope that life as a genin could offer more than what he currently had was what kept him going. What he could not have known was how becoming a member of Team 7 would impact him. At first, he hated a lot of things about his team. His sensei, Kakashi, was a smut lover who suffered from a serious case of chronic lateness, and his male teammate, Sasuke, could be described in 3 words: dark moody bastard. The only redeeming quality was the fact that the third member of their team was Sakura, the pink-haired girl he had a crush on. Unfortunately, even she was tainted due to having taken a liking to the Uchiha, Iju. Initially, the team suffered from obvious incompatibility issues. But the various missions they embarked on strengthened their bond as a team. They fought together, watched each other's backs, cared for each other. Eventually, Naruto realized that he had found something. Whatever it was, he had never felt it before, but he knew it was special. True, they all had their differences, but even with those differences, they were still able to come together to work towards a common goal. As time passed, he realized that being a member of Team 7 was probably what it felt like to have a family. He wasn't sure since he had never had a family of his own, but he imagined that this was what having a family would be like. Today was one of those perfect days that only comes on rare occasions. Those days where the sun rises to a place high in the sky. Thin cirrus clouds litter the atmosphere, and the serene skyscape is topped off by a cool breeze that sends the trees into a gentle sway. The small group of birds flying in V formation only added to the peaceful setting as they slowly flapped their way through the sky. Watching the steady flapping of their wings was relaxing. At least as relaxing as possible with the state of mind Naruto was currently in. How could such a beautiful day go so wrong? He struggled to make sense of it. What was meant to be a simple visit to a friend in the hospital had turned into an all-out brawl on the hospital rooftops. It was no secret that he and Sasuke didn't exactly get along, but what happened on that hospital rooftop was still a shock to him. He had conjured up this image of his perfect family with Team 7, but it was all falling apart before his eyes. Looking back, he supposed that he could see it coming. The truth was he didn't want to. He wanted this to be the perfect family he never had, but it wasn't. Denying that was the same as denying reality. To top it all off, Sakura almost got caught in the middle of their little scuffle. Fortunately, Kakashi was there to stop the two before any serious damage could be done, at least physically. No one had arrived soon enough to stop the emotional damage. And so, Naruto was left to walk the rooftops of Konoha. Alone, as usual, one foot crossed in front of the other in what felt like an unending loop. 1 step, 2 step, 3 step. The only differences came when there was an obstacle in the way. A foot would lift slightly higher to step over a pipe, or the two would work in tandem to balance on a thin beam-like structure, and every now and then, one would kick out violently at a random piece of trash, sending it careening into the village below with a barely audible thud. He used one arm to vault off the rooftop he had been walking on, then dropped down onto a not-so-crowded alleyway as silent as a mouse. The wind rushed against his whiskers as he fell to the ground. It was a feeling that would normally be exhilarating, but not today. As his feet fell back into a steady rhythm, he noticed Jiraiya standing on the side of the road. Naruto didn't slow his movements, but at that moment, there was a part of him that was hopeful. For what? He wasn't quite sure, but when Jiraiya kept silent as he walked by, he knew he hadn't found it. As his trek through the alleyways of Konoha continued, he eventually stumbled onto Sakura leaning against a wall. Her usually bright features had dimmed considerably, and her slim arms wrapped her body uncomfortably. The guilt gnawing at his conscience was his first indication that he couldn't leave things the way they were. When he was a few feet away, he simply settled for saying her name, Sakura-chan. She glanced at him while keeping her head bowed and silently said, "There's something I need to tell you. Well, make it a date, so walk with me for a bit." The quick lurch in Naruto's movements was more than enough to convey his confusion. Sakura-chan wanted to go on a date with him. But why now? She'd never seriously considered the idea before. "You coming?" Sakura called over her shoulder, her thin frame already a couple of steps ahead. Her question was answered when she heard the pit-pat of Naruto's sandals jogging up to her side. A scaly, tan-colored lizard scurried away, its color nearly matching the dirt road it had come from. Naruto watched as it ran into a small hole under one of the food shops lining the streets, then peeked its head back out to observe the surroundings. After walking in awkward silence for a bit longer, Naruto decided he should be the first to speak. "I should apologize." His tone was serious, not anything like his usual joking demeanor. He waited for a reply but heard nothing except food stand workers sharpening their knives in the background. It didn't take long for him to notice that Sakura was staring at the ground blankly, clearly in a world of her own. "Sakura-chan?" Sakura was knocked out of her trance and finally lifted her head to turn to him. "Oh, sorry," she said while shaking her head. "Guess I spaced out." "It's okay," he replied, turning away. "I don't blame you with everything that happened today. That's actually what I was gonna talk to you about." "It's all right, Naruto," she replied, both hands now meekly folded over her stomach. "There's nothing okay about what happened today, Sakura-chan. I wanted to say I am sorry. I know when I told you not to interfere earlier, it might be sounded harsh, but one of the main reasons I said that is because I don't ever want to see you get hurt. If Kakashi hadn't stopped me and Sasuke, that could have been you caught in the middle of those attacks. I don't know what I would do if I ever hurt you." The last part came out as a whisper, although Sakura had just managed to hear it. Sakura gave a silent nod to show that she understood, then smiled, and whispered, "Apology accepted." "Thanks," Naruto replied, wearing his first smile since the incident. It was a small smile, but there, nonetheless. "So, what were you gonna tell me?" Sakura walked a little farther before the question registered with her. All at once, her eyes dropped a bit and what seemed to be a wave of sadness washed over her visage. After a while, the first words she spoke were his name, "Sasuke-kun." "Ah," Naruto said, sighing a bit. "I am sorry," she said dropping her head. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Naruto replied, but if he was honest with himself, it really wasn't. When she had invited him on this date, he thought that maybe she was pitying him. Sasuke was the one who started the hospital fight. After all, while it wasn't really how he would have wanted to get his first date, he would have taken it, and, if he was honest, it might be actually brightened up his day some. Unfortunately, it looked like he wasn't even that lucky. "So, what is it?" he finally asked, both hands stuffed deep in his pockets as they walked. She paused briefly then said, "He didn't want me to tell you this. It's Orochimaru's fault." "What's Orochimaru's fault?" Sakura went on to explain how Sasuke now had some type of curse mark and how it was affecting his mind, making him lash out in anger at random. Apparently, Orochimaru had given it to him and offered him power if he would join him. She explained that she and Kakashi were on a short list of people who knew about it and that Kakashi had tried to reassure her that everything would be okay. Naruto could see that she wasn't convinced. She was worried, deeply worried, probably even more so after seeing Sasuke lash out again today. After a moment of silence, Naruto looked ahead and said, "Orochimaru, huh?" Sakura's response was a dejected but clear nod. "I saw him." Sakura's head swiveled towards him, her pink hair swaying from the sudden jerk of movement as emerald green eyes came to rest on Naruto's face. "Orochimaru?" "Yeah," Naruto replied. "He fought Granny Tsunade and Pervy Sage." After thinking back to the adrenaline-pumping encounter for a bit, he whispered, "He's really strong." Sakura turned away slowly, choosing to refocus her attention on the ground in front of her toes. "So, it is true," she whispered. Orochimaru does have a lot to offer. One glance at her face was all Naruto needed to see that she was more bothered than she was letting on. The pale face, the nearly lifeless green eyes, the persistent self-hug she had started giving herself, her face betrayed her and screamed everything she was trying to hide. From how she had spoken about things, she made it sound like she was just worried about Sasuke, but it wasn't just worry, it was fear. She was scared. Scared that Sasuke would take up Orochimaru on his offer. That she'd lose him. After a while, Naruto let out a small smile, deciding to do the only thing he felt he could do. "Cheer up, Sakura-chan," he said, gently nudging her side with his elbow and grinning a sort of cheesy grin. "Sasuke would never join that creep." "You really think so?" she asked, now turning to face him with skeptical eyes. "Yeah," Naruto shrugged, "I mean, Sasuke's plenty strong. He doesn't need to go to some weird snake guy to try to get stronger. Don't let it worry you, okay?" At first, she didn't seem convinced, but Naruto could see the cogs turning in her mind as she stared up into the faintly orange sky. She was obviously engaging in some Shikamaru-level thinking, but despite the mental hoops her mind was going through, she managed a silent, "Thank you." It was the first time he saw her smile since the hospital. It was nice. Allowing himself a faint smile of his own, he softly replied, "Don't mention it." Sakura watched as the top half of the sun peered from behind the Hokage monument and painted the village in a brilliant yellow hue. The sky was a fading orange color now, although a small part of it had already transitioned into a deep blue, signaling the coming night. A wonderful sunset always made her feel a sense of serenity and calm, but seeing the state Naruto was in had the opposite effect. His usually vibrant blue eyes had taken on an icy shade of blue, and he was much quieter than usual. Every now and then, she would say something to try to make conversation, but all she got from him were a few words here or a small smile there. Eventually, the two of them fell into a sort of agreed-upon silence. As far as dates went, this one was going pretty rough, although she did suppose part of it was her fault. Bringing up Sasuke in such a straightforward way was a bonehead move given what had happened earlier, and any sensible person would have probably used a different approach. But once again, she had let her emotions get the best of her. She was wondering what she could do to cheer him up when she spotted Ichiraku's looming in the distance, its red and white drapes flapping in the wind. Aha! If she didn't know anything about Naruto Uzumaki, she knew he was a ramen-loving fool. Smiling, she turned towards him and said, "Hey, wanna grab some Ichirakus? I did say it was a date, after all." The question lingered in the air for a few seconds before Naruto's head jolted up, recognizing that he had been spoken to. "Huh? You're not a very good dating partner," she said, crossing her arms teasingly. A soft smile graced Naruto's lips as he scratched the back of his neck nervously. "Sorry, Sakura-chan. Just had a lot on my mind with everything that's happened today." She uncrossed her arms, dropping her feigned anger. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. Naruto wore a small smile as his eyes settled on the ground. A few steps later, he looked forward and said, Yeah, I am fine, Sakura-chan." Sakura examined him for a bit, then decided not to push things any further than that. It had been a rough day, so it made sense for him to still be reeling. Maybe he just needed some time to bounce back. They all did. "So," she said, nudging him a bit, "I was actually asking you if you wanted to get some ramen. I know I had kinda said this was a date, so it only seems fair." Tucci and Ayame were already waving at the two to come on over, and Sakura could even see a small cat that had started hanging around the ramen shop a few weeks ago. It came and curled between Naruto's legs affectionately as if to extend her invitation as well. She had a gray and black striped pattern coating her fur and looked to be pretty well fed by the looks of it. She looked like she was in between being a cat and a kitten, a true kitty cat. "You greedy furball," Naruto whispered, picking her up gently. "You just want me to drop you some food, don't you?" Sakura giggled at that. "Well," she prodded, "what do you say? Even the cat wants you to stay." She watched him eye the half-cat, half-kitten affectionately as his hand softly stroked the coarse fur. The thought of staying seemed to cross his mind, but not for very long. He gave the ramen shop one last look over, then gently set down the kitten and said, Nah, not today." Sakura propped both hands on her hips and half yelled, "You don't want ramen?" The way she said it made it sound more like a surprised accusation than a question. "Not today, Sakura-chan." Sakura was not buying it. With an accusing eyebrow raised high, she said, "Come on, Naruto. You can't tell me you're seriously considering leaving with ramen in the equation?" Sorry, Sakura-chan, I just don't feel like eating right now. But what about the date? She asked, confident that her little reminder would make him stay. She could tell that Naruto had tried to force a smile, but it was even less convincing than the ones he tried before. Don't take it personally, Sakura-chan, it's been a long day, I just want to go home. Oh, Sakura replied, blinking back her shock at his statement. She was sure that her reminder of this being a date would make him stay, but it hadn't even fazed him. This side of him was so uncommon. Usually, he was so full of energy, but now, he just looked so drained. After a drawn-out silence between the two, an awkward smile settled on Sakura's lips as she half raised her hand to wave goodbye. Okay. I guess I'll see you around then. Yeah, Naruto replied, nodding slightly. He then gave Tuchi and Ayame a small wave as he turned to leave. The kitten tried to follow him, curling around his legs once more, but he just patted her head smoothly before motioning for her to go back to the ramen shop. Instead, she sat in place for what seemed like an eternity, watching him walk away through the thin black slits in her yellow eyes. Naruto snaked his way through the dense crowd with both hands burrowed deep into his pockets. His eyes were tired. Heck, he even felt like his eyelids were tired, but he still had just enough strength to lift them up to scan the village surroundings. The village was remarkably different at night. It bustled with a different type of life, the nightlife. Businesses lined each side of the street, content to simply serve their customers and make them happy. Restaurants bathed customers in warm yellow lights to set a more mellow mood, and small knick-knack shops seemed to employ warm lights to better advertise their products. There was even a faint smell of grilled meat in the air. Possibly from that barbecue restaurant Choji liked. It was a relaxing atmosphere all in all, so relaxing that Naruto almost forgot about his present troubles, almost, that is, until he was greeted by a deep raspy voice resonating in the corridors of his mind. There was a small chuckle followed by a noticeable pause, and then the voice came like a purr in the night. Naruto Uzumaki turning down ramen and a date with his precious Sakura-chan. All in one day. I guess hell must be frozen over recently. Great, just what he needed, something else to sour the day for him, as if it wasn't already crappy enough. Any chance he had at cheering up disappeared after hearing the fox's comment, and all he could find the strength to do was mumble, "Just leave me alone." "Ah, I see you've still got some attitude left, niece." Naruto decided not to respond and instead kept trudging along. Maybe the fox would leave him alone that way. "So, you're just going to ignore me? Not very good manners." Naruto raised a hand to massage his temple. "You know, I just wanted to be alone for a bit. You think you can do that, huh? Maybe just shut up, for, like, 3 seconds? Okay. 1, 2, 3. The fox replied with a sickening chuckle, "I am back." Naruto shut both eyes to take a moment, then opened them after he had cooled off a bit. "I hate you," he whispered, reaching for his apartment door. "Hate me?" The fox laughed. "Hating me is the same as hating yourself. We're both jumbled up in here, remember?" Naruto remained silent and stepped inside, deciding to ignore the overgrown orange hairball. The fox might have said something else, but Naruto didn't hear it. He just fell into a daze of sorts. With a toss, his apartment key slid onto his coffee table, then he started his lazy trek towards his bedroom. The door let out a high-pitched squeak as he pulled it open, and upon examining the room, he noticed that everything was just like it usually was. There was his unmade bed with the sheets tossed randomly to the side, his alarm clock with its broken alarm, his frog-shaped wallet spilling out some pocket change, and the smell of instant ramen cooked into the walls. Everything being in its proper place was actually a plus, since other kids would sometimes break into his house and mess with stuff for no good reason. He always told himself that they were just stupid, or maybe misguided. Yep, just a bunch of stupid misguided kids. Peeved. The fox laughed. "Misguided? Really, kid? What about all of those grown men who don't let you eat at their restaurants? Are they misguided too?" "Shut up, heh heh heh, it's the truth though." "No, it's not." "Stop lying to yourself." "I never lie to myself." "Huh, liar, that's another lie right there. You should be careful about that. The strongest lies are the lies you tell yourself you know." Naruto let out a steadying breath as both eyes involuntarily looked towards the ceiling. "Thank you, oh wise one," he mumbled, walking over to his bed. "You're very welcome. If you want, there's more advice where that came from." Naruto raised both hands to his head, sweeping them across his face dramatically as he plopped down onto the bed. "Can you please just shut up?" Truth hurts, doesn't it? Naruto's eyes fell shut on their own. The only thing that hurts is having to hear your ashy voice when I am already having a bad day. Haha, that's nice, I like it, but you're still not fooling me. I know that you can't seriously believe all of those villagers are just misguided. As you put it, that would just make you even more of a naive fool than I took you for. Guess I am a naive fool then. I am not buying it. You should actually take my disbelief as a compliment. It means I don't think you're stupid enough to actually believe what you just said. What do you want me to do? Say I am honored? Nah, I just want you to acknowledge the facts. These villagers hate you, and if there's one thing I've learned in my many years, it's that history is the best way to predict future behavior. If they hate you now, then they're always gonna hate you. A feeling that could only be described as boiling rage coursed through Naruto's veins before he jolted upright on his bed. Closing his eyes in a split moment of concentration, he opened them to find himself exactly where he intended to be, in the fox chamber. The darkness of the chamber was thick and seemed to choke the air, same as always, but through the darkness and into that cursed chamber, Naruto could see the darkened silhouette of the fox. Blood-red eyes peered back at him and a twisted grin could be faintly seen revealing rows of sharp canines. In the past, he had felt fear at the sight, but now it was something else entirely. Not when I am Hokage, he retorted, eyes flashing with rage. After that statement, Naruto heard the loudest cackle of laughter he had ever heard from the fox in his life and watched as the fox threw his head back in ecstasy. Hokage? Another fit of laughter followed. You'll be lucky to make it to Chunin. Pausing then swallowing a bit at the fox's reaction, Naruto replied, what are you talking about? Kid, they only promote one ninja each exam, and I highly doubt they'll pass you anytime soon. How much formal training did you have before the academy? 0. The best sensei you've ever had is Jiraiya and he's running off being a pervert half the time. If you still think you've got a chance at being Hokage, you're way more of a fool than I took you for. Well, I am just about as strong as Sasuke is now, he stammered, so I like my chances. Yeah, you're right, the fox acknowledged, nodding. You might even be stronger than him at the moment, but despite that fact, everyone still treats you the same, don't they? Interesting, isn't it? Naruto stood staring at the fox for a few moments, then turned away with furrowed eyebrows. I am done listening to you. Come on, don't run away, the fox whined sarcastically, grinning in glee. You know, on second thought, maybe you should. He quickly stalked up to the edge of the cage, revealing mounds of orange fur in the process. Come on, he purred, I know you've considered it before, just pack up your things and leave. Yeah, leave and go where? Naruto replied, his voice slightly shaky. Some other village where people will hate me. No thanks, I've got enough problems as it is. Who said anything about going to another village? That won't solve any of your problems. What you need, the fox continued while wagging a finger, is someone who can help you tap into your true potential. And who's that? The fox's bloodshot eyes narrowed, and his mouth formed a disturbing grin that Naruto couldn't bring himself to trust. You can't be serious, why not? The fox responded. I've learned a great deal in my time on this earth, all valuable lessons that I could pass on to you. I am not listening to this, Naruto said, scoffing into his shoulder. Think about it, the fox said, an aggressive undertone lining his voice. Not only would you have someone training you full-time, but you'd have the added bonus of access to my power. In the past, you've had to wrestle me for my power in dire situations. Imagine if I gave it to you willingly. Stop it, Naruto said, two fingers moving up to pinch the bridge of his nose. No, the fox purred, grinning a grin that screamed ill intent. I will not be ignored, boy. People have taught you to fear my power. I could teach you to control it, wield it, maybe even master it. I am not hearing this, he said, using his hands to cover both ears. You could leave and train somewhere far from here, become stronger than they could possibly imagine. Stop. The cry echoed off the walls of Naruto's mind and slowly faded until there was nothing left but bone-chilling silence. A few moments later, the fox took a very calm step back from the iron bars and said, or you could stay here and roll the dice, who knows, maybe you'll even make Chunin one day. As the fox's last statement reached Naruto's ears, he found that his body had gone rigid. Paralyzed by the small part of him wondering about the truth in the fox's words, it was a while until he started to regain the functionality in his limbs. Each finger twitched gently as the blood began to circulate again. As the feeling returned to his hands, He turned them over to look into his palms. After a while, he balled them up into angry fists. Traitors. They couldn't block out any of the fox's cutting words, nor could they lessen the impact they had. His thoughts were interrupted by a strange hissing sound coming from outside. The strange hiss rang through the walls of the apartment, jerking him back to the real world unapologetically. Tiredly, he raised a hand to massage his neck as he got up to investigate. Always something, he grumbled. As he neared the door, the hissing sound stopped and was replaced by a rapid back and forth clicking sound. A low growl escaped his throat and his fists clenched as he reached for his front door, shaking with renewed anger. Now he knew what it was. "You jerks!" he yelled, yanking his front door open. The trio of masked genin looked like they'd been caught with their hands in the cookie jar. "Oh, shoot!" one of them exclaimed. "He's home." The three cut tail and ran away in a flurry, with one of them taking a small tumble as he leapt from the doorstep. "That's what you get, you turd!" Naruto yelled as the clumsy schoolboy recovered from his unscheduled appointment with the ground. After the group had disappeared into the village, Naruto's eyes darted across the ground, spotting an abandoned spray paint can. Fresh blue paint lined the spray tip, and one glance at his door revealed that the group had already done a little spraying before he caught them. A low growl escaped his throat as he snatched up the can, chucking it in the direction they had run off in. "And take this with you," he yelled. The can flew less than 30 feet and landed on the ground with a clank, rolling sideways for a bit before coming to a stop. Turning away, he walked back into the apartment and slammed the door shut behind him, muscles tensing uncontrollably. An empty ramen cup was unfortunate enough to be left lying on the ground and quickly met his foot as he kicked it across the room with a frustrated yell. "Why is there always something? I thought stupid pranks like this stopped at the academy." His chest rose and fell in between words. "If it isn't trouble with the team, it's dealing with those jerks." "Yep," the fox laughed, "and if it isn't having to deal with those jerks, it's having to deal with me." The fox's laughter reverberated in Naruto's mind, but there was no laughter on Naruto's part. He just stood there, shaking. A moment later, he turned towards his room with a snarl, snatching up any item unfortunate enough to be in his reach. Without warning, his alarm clock was chucked across the room and sent crashing into the wall. A distinct lightning-shaped crack split the frame, and a piece of the silver bell was sent splintering off at some odd angle skywards. Good. His frog-shaped wallet was the next victim. A sweaty, paint-stained palm reaching out and grabbing it furiously, the wallet turned into a green blur as a baseball toss sent it speeding towards the wall and crashing into it with a clank. The green pouch fell to the wooden floor dramatically, freeing up various currencies to roll about. Books, scrolls, clothes. All violently thrown in an attempt to bury the pain, but it wouldn't go away. Tears soon wet the sides of his cheeks as every throw grew more erratic than the last. "Why isn't it helping?" "That's not gonna change anything," the fox said in between throws. "Shut up!" Naruto yelled, tightening his grip on the next object in his rampage. It was only after throwing it that he realized what it was. The picture of Team 7 spun towards the wall and hit it with a decided crack before falling face down on the floor. Concern slowly replaced the rage in Naruto's eyes as he stood frozen. With a frantic step forward, he quickly made his way over to the downed item. Repeated echoes of no, leaving his lips. All he could do was hope it wasn't broken. But as he flipped the picture around in his hands, he saw that the damage had already been done. A spiderweb-like crack started at the bottom corner of the frame and ran up the entirety of the picture. Kakashi and Sakura were unevenly split by the fracture, while he and Sasuke stood resolutely on different sides. Still wet eyes squinted to examine the damage as he ran a finger along the cracks that had formed. It was ruined. The picture stared back at him mockingly. His so-called family was broken. Slowly, his body came to rest on the floor next to his bed with both arms curling around his knees weakly. Deep crinkles formed around his eyes as he tried to squeeze them shut, eventually grimacing in an attempt to stop the tears. But he couldn't. Not this time. It was then that he felt that heavy feeling weighing down his chest again. That heavy sense of despair he couldn't escape as a child, that pain that was always trying to claw its way into his soul. By the end of the night, he wondered if it would have its way. Both arms wrapped around his form a bit tighter as the thought haunted his very being. The tears fell not long after, each one carrying the weight of 1,000 sorrows. He wanted so desperately to act like everything was okay, like the day hadn't happened, like his life hadn't happened. But it did, and there came a point where he could no longer ignore the pain. "Is this what I am meant to be?" if the coming night was any indication of the answer to that question. The universe had a good sense of humor. The words had barely left his lips when a stroke of moonlight passed through the curtain, slowly painting the room in dim grayscale. It was unclear whether he felt anything while watching his room transform into a shadow of its former self, but if he did, he didn't show it. He simply sat there, motionless. The only thing to ever affect the slightest change in his features was when he noticed how at home Kakashi's hair looked, all a matter of perspective. A small part of him wanted to turn on the lights, to chase away the darkness. But he ignored it and sat there. He would much rather stop these stupid tears instead, but he knew better. He had learned long ago that trying to stop the tears just made it worse, much worse, but still, with how long the tears had been falling, he wondered, would there ever be an end? He got his answer after about half an hour or so, but by that time he didn't care to stop anymore. The spot at the feet of his bed was comfortable by now, so he decided to stay there, eventually losing track of time in the process. The time for supper came and passed, but he didn't feel like moving, so he didn't. If he was honest, he could probably sit there until morning with no problem and just sleep the night away. The idea was tempting, but he cursed himself for knowing that it wouldn't change anything. His eyes slowly scanned the recently upturned room, bringing a small frown to his face as he realized he'd probably have to clean it all up eventually. What time was it anyway? His eyes skidded the floor looking for his alarm clock, but upon spotting it, he realized it was broken, stuck with the ticker trying to flick past the time it had been when it crashed into the wall. Great, just great. Sighing, he looked towards the broken picture lying on his floor and gently lifted it to his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was dry and tired. Bet you think I am a wimp, don't you, Fox? There was a dragging silence before an overly long yawn was heard from the confines of the fox's chamber. Finding a comfortable spot to rest his head on his paws, he smacked his lips 3 times, then replied, "No, just stupid." Naruto huffed, although his face barely changed from its hardened expression. "Figures," he replied. "At least I can always count on you to speak your mind. Makes talking to you a whole lot more interesting." "Thought you didn't like hearing me talk. Something about my ashy voice." "Yeah, I did say that, didn't I?" He gave a lifeless shrug and continued, "Guess talking to you is better than not talking to anybody, and you're a bit easier to talk to since we're both." He waved a hand absent-mindedly. "Jumbled up in here, as you put it." "Yeah," the fox replied. "Guess that makes sense." A few moments later, Naruto glanced around his upturned room. He felt tired suddenly, or maybe he had been feeling that way all night. He was too confused to remember anymore. Looking back down into his lap, he whispered, "I am sitting in the middle of my room, in the middle of the night, talking to a giant orange fox. I must be losing my mind." "Half the people in this village are," the fox said in a matter-of-factly tone. "Just look at your team." "Yeah, I guess you're right." The following silence was drawn out, but strangely comfortable. Much like the silence one enjoys when going out into an open field, it was peaceful, mellow, quiet. "Hey, Fox." "What?" There was a brief pause, then Naruto asked the question that had been haunting him for a good portion of the night. "Do you really think I'll never become Hokage?" Silence preceded the answer, and it left Naruto feeling empty inside, almost like he didn't have anything of substance left in him, just dry bones and bare flesh. A part of him wished it was fear of the answer that had seized his soul, but he wasn't afraid of the answer. He was afraid that he already knew it. "No," the fox replied bluntly. "From my experience, a Hokage is usually elected by the people because they trust that person." Naruto's eyes narrowed, creasing the skin in between his eyebrows. "And they hate me." "Yeah," the fox replied, pausing, "but the Hokage is also usually the strongest ninja around as well, so leaving and getting stronger couldn't hurt your chances. Maybe when they see you're stronger, they'll come around." "You really think so?" Naruto asked, although there wasn't much life left in his voice. "Maybe." There was a noticeable pause as Naruto considered the proposition, but after a while, he just shook his head disapprovingly. "It's a nice thought, Fox, but we'd be caught before we made it past the wall." "Not if we did things my way." "And what's your way?" A low chuckle escaped the fox's throat as he straightened up in his cage. "Come in here," he said. Naruto shut his eyes and opened them. Standing in front of the iron prison he was growing more and more accustomed to seeing. Through the darkness, he could see the fox leaning forward. "First," he purred, tail slowly wagging in the background, "I have to know if you're in or out." "I can't be undecided." "Nope," the fox replied, rows of canines showing as he grinned from ear to ear. Naruto lifted his head up to look into the fox's eyes as the storm began to brew within himself. Could he really risk everything he had in Konoha to run off in the vague hope of getting stronger? The thought seemed crazy but strangely alluring. It was a new adventure. No pesky villagers, no annoying genin, no one to tell him what he should do. Just him, and the fox. Couldn't forget that important bit of information. Look, the fox said, leaning forward a bit more, just ask yourself this. When you're old and gray, do you want to look back and think about what could have been if you had taken a chance, or, his lips parted, revealing a sly grin. Do you want to say you had the guts to partner with the nine-tailed fox? Naruto remained silent as he lowered his gaze down into the murky water splashing up the sides of his feet. His reflection moved with the ripples in the water and stared back at him. He hoped it would have an answer, that it would tell him what to do, but it didn't. It was just as clueless as he was, and he was left not knowing what to think, but maybe that was the problem. He thought about things too much. He was no Shikamaru. It was about time he stopped pretending to be one. Thinking was overrated anyway. Lifting his eyes from the water, he shook his head and said, "We're not gonna get 2 miles, fox. Are you in?" Deep blue met blood red as the desperate young boy and the cunning old fox stared at each other. Naruto standing with arms crossed, the fox sitting on his back paws. The iron bars separating the two seemed to fade into the background as they stared. Unblinking, unmoving, and just a tad bit untrusting. Naruto was the first to blink as he turned away. "All right," he shrugged, "let's see what you got." The fox grinned, showing his jagged rows of teeth once more. "Very good," he purred. "All right. Stop being so creepy," Naruto replied, finding the fox's face quite disturbing to look at. "What's in it for you?" "Who, me?" the fox asked, making an innocent face as he raised a paw to his chest. "Yeah, you." Tilting his head upwards, the fox scratched his chin. "Well, if I am honest, there isn't really much in it for me. I am just an old fox, but if I can help Konoha lose its precious Jinchuriki, I would feel a lot better." "Jinchuriki?" Naruto asked. "Yeah, Jinchuriki," the fox replied. "That's what people who have tailed beasts living in them are called. That's why everyone hates you. Why they can't trust you, because you've got me." "Well, thanks, you've really brightened up my life." "Hey, don't blame me, kid, I didn't ask to get trapped in here." "Trapped? What are you talking about?" The fox paused briefly, then gave a low chuckle that shook the chamber as he leaned forward. "Kid, do you really think you were just born with me?" Naruto's eyes widened ever so slightly as he stepped closer to the iron bars. "What are you talking about?" Another grin crept onto the fox's lips. "We have a lot of questions, don't we? Do you have answers?" "Maybe," the fox said, grinning and giving a slight shrug, "but don't worry, they'll be answered in time." "I want an answer now." "Well, too bad," the fox said, tilting his head. "If I told you everything up front, you'd probably toss me to the side as soon as you didn't need me anymore. Believe it or not, I am not like you. I don't just use people." "Neither do I," the fox chuckled. "I just protect my own interests, which is something you should also learn to do." Scoffing, Naruto turned away. "Fine," he muttered, "but eventually, you're going to tell me what you know." "Of course," the fox said, rubbing his nose. "A deal's a deal, but for now, we have to get ready." "Get ready for what?" "So," Naruto said, eyeing the fox, "what now?" "First of all, let's get one thing straight," the fox replied, raising a finger. "If this is gonna work, you're gonna have to do exactly as I say." "That wasn't part of the deal," Naruto replied, eyes narrowing slightly. "I know," the fox said, smiling and looking cheeky as ever, "but let's be honest, you have no idea what you're doing." The fox rested his head on his front paws as he grew serious. "What we're trying to do is actually a lot harder than you think it is, and we can't afford to make mistakes. Once you leave, you're gonna be labeled a rogue. I can get us out of here, but you've gotta trust me." Looking away, Naruto considered what had been said, then turned back to the fox. "Fine," he said, "I'll start packing." "Packing what?" "My backpack." No. What? I am just gonna leave all of my stuff behind." "You're not taking it all with you, that's for sure." "You've gotta be kidding me," Naruto said, arms crossing all on their own. "I knew this was a bad idea." "Let me ask you a question," the fox replied, smiling an obviously fake smile. "Do you really think carrying loads of stuff that's gonna weigh you down is a good idea when you're on the run?" Do you?" Naruto paused, pondering the question, then silently mumbled, "I didn't really think about that." "Yeah, I know," the fox replied, holding his tight-lipped smile in place. "That's why you should just let me do the thinking, okay?" A small huff left Naruto's lips, but eventually, he grumbled out, "Fine." "Good," the fox replied, all 9 tails wagging in the darkness behind him. "Now," he continued, cracking his neck both ways, "we're gonna need to start getting ready, so get your wallet." "Gama-chan?" "Yeah, you've got some money saved up, right?" "Yeah, but what do I need it for?" The fox grinned from ear to ear. "You're gonna do some shopping." Naruto strolled through the village while trying to maintain his inconspicuous profile. It was night now, so the bustling atmosphere provided some much-desired cover. The food stands and outlying shops attracted much attention, and it was a huge plus that over half the people in the crowd were taller than him. He was nothing but an orange speck. And that was all he wanted to be. He snaked through the bodies lining the streets until he finally arrived at one of the stores where they sold storage scrolls. The fox's instructions echoed in his mind as he approached the door. "You're going to buy some storage scrolls." Naruto opened the door to the shop, triggering a dangling set of chimes hooked on the doorway. A ginger-looking old lady in a gray kimono was sitting at the front desk waiting for her next customer. "Hi there, young man, can I help you?" "Hello," Naruto greeted. "I am looking to buy a storage scroll." "Oh, you've come to the right place." She raised both arms elegantly to showcase the various scrolls littered on wooden shelves all over the shop. "We have an abundance of storage scrolls here. How big would you like?" "For now, just get some that are a bit bigger than the ones you already have. If you need more space in the future, you can upgrade, but for our purposes, we travel light." "Do you have any medium-sized scrolls?" The old lady seemed delighted to hear him ask, and he heard her feet shuffle against the wooden floor as she scurried to the back. He heard a few boxes sliding around in the back, and then, a moment later, she returned from her journey carrying too many scrolls for her frail body. Some of them were way bigger than Naruto needed, but he figured the old lady was just excited to have some business. "Fancy any of these?" she asked while struggling to set them down in front of him. Naruto wasted no time looking through them and quickly settled on one with a dark red case. It was a relatively small thing, portable, light, useful. "I think this'll work. Give me 2 please." He paid the lady in full and the chimes jingled as he left and started walking towards the next task the fox had given him. "Next, you'll need to stock up on weapons and things like traps. Going rogue is like asking for a fight. You have to make sure you're ready for one." As Naruto passed the various food stands, toy shops, and apparel boutiques in the village, he kept his head low. His slender figure moved like a shadow through the crowd. He was a dark orange blur to the few who noticed him and completely invisible to the rest. Within a few minutes, he was at his next destination. He walked into the weapons shop and stopped short as he spotted a familiar face. Tenten was sitting behind the front desk and tracing her finger along the edge of a very elegant kunai as she admired it. Naruto walked into her field of view joking as usual. "Don't cut yourself," he said, both arms tucked into his pants pockets. "Of course not," Tenten replied with a smile as she tucked the kunai into a hidden thigh holster. "So, what are you, of all people, doing here?" she asked. "I just got paid for a mission recently. Thought I'd check out some weapons." He motioned towards the outside and said, "But if I am not welcome?" "Of course not," she blurted out while waving both hands frantically. "You came to the right place, Uzumaki." She spun around to the wall of weapons behind her and began her pitch, motioning to each object as she spoke. "We've got kunai. We've got shuriken, swords, axes, bows. You name it. We've also got things like traps." She leaned towards him with one hand pressed against her mouth as if she was telling him a secret. "You're a ninja, so you know what I am talking about. Explosive tags, tripwires, etc." Naruto chuckled a bit, then examined his options and listed off what he'd be taking. Tenten gladly loaded him up and told him to come again soon as he departed with a handful of weapons and traps. He felt a little guilty knowing he had no plans of being back anytime soon, but the time for sentiment had passed a long time ago. Now was the time for action. When he reached his apartment, he wasted no time in doing as the fox had said. "Stash the weapons in your ninja pouch as usual, and any leftovers can go in one of the scrolls you bought." Within seconds, the scrolls he would be using to pack were sprawled out on the wooden floor. He already had one at home, so he now had 3 total. He worked on the weapons scroll first, and it didn't take long for him to pack the weapons in a semi-organized manner. He did notice that the traps seemed to be intent on giving him some trouble though. One of them almost took off a finger when it slammed shut out of nowhere. Good thing he had quick reflexes. When he was done, he sealed the scroll and watched as all of the shiny metal disappeared in a puff of smoke, leaving a dark, red scroll behind. The used scroll was a smaller capacity scroll, so he used it to carry simpler weapons and some personal effects. When he reached the final scroll, he stopped his work and made 3 shadow clones. You know what to do. The 3 clones nodded and split up, each going to clean a different section of the small apartment. Naruto watched the clones for a moment, then returned his attention to the final scroll. Only the criticals. Naruto grabbed some underwear and a few changes of casual clothes. Opting to leave his other jumpsuit behind, he packed Gamma-chan, who now felt a lot skinnier, and strapped his watch onto his wrist. After packing a sleeping bag, a map, and some toiletries, he looked towards his kitchen cupboard with a smirk. A few cups of ramen wouldn't hurt. He packed them nicely and decided to carry the map in his ninja pouch instead. When he was satisfied with how everything was packed away, he sealed the scroll with a final poof of gray smoke. Inhaling deeply, he spun the scroll around in his hand, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment from everything he had done. A moment later, it was neatly stashed away in his ninja pouch. As he rose from his knees, he fidgeted with the ninja pouch until it was secure, then gave it a small pat as he let out a content sigh. Now what? He asked. Now, nothing, you're done. Take a break. Go shower while your clones finish cleaning up. When they're done, we move. Naruto nodded and raised a hand to salute. Yes, sir. His voice was a little tired, so he figured the fox's shower suggestion was spot on. He needed to relax some, especially if the fox was right about the magnitude of what he was about to do. As he headed to the bathroom, he stopped and took a moment to look around his small apartment. This was the place he called home for most of his life, and now he was leaving it behind. The thought saddened him a bit, but he wasn't leaving without reason. And besides, he'd be back one day, and things would be different. While his eyes were still scanning the soon-to-be abandoned room, they fell onto an old blue notebook with discolored yellow pages from the academy. He used to doodle in it back then, especially if the class he was in was one of those eternal genjutsu classes. The memory brought a genuine smile to his lips, but as his grin faded, he realized it might be time for one last entry. Before long, he was sitting down at the kitchen table with an orange pencil twirling in his fingers. What are you doing? The fox asked. Naruto gave a soft smile as he tightened his grip on the pencil. I am saying goodbye. Are you insane? If you do that, they'll know you left earlier than if you didn't say anything. The grimace that crossed Naruto's face showed his inner conflict, and the way he froze in his seat showed the brewing turmoil. But he knew it wouldn't stop him. He would have to take the chance. Leaving without saying anything just felt wrong. I have to, he finally said, leaning forward and gripping the pencil tighter. As the pencil started its jerky motion on the paper, the fox sighed and said, You're gonna have to hightail it. The only indication that Naruto heard him was a curt nod. It was a cold night tonight. Naruto could feel the goosebumps taking over his arms as he jumped from rooftop to rooftop with the village wall looming in the distance. It was a pale beige-colored wall that was probably around 80 feet high, but with his ninja skills, he figured it wouldn't be too much of a challenge to get over. The fox had insisted on going out the city over the wall, which made sense if Naruto thought about it. Who would let some kid leave in the middle of the night through the front gates? Not anyone in their right mind. Their destination was the hidden hot water village, or at least some caves in that area. The people there were supposed to be very peaceful, so the fox said it was the common sense choice. They would probably be able to live in peace and no one would bother them about their training. It was a win-win. As Naruto continued his journey through Konoha's rooftops, he was surprised to find that there was actually a good deal of variety in the rooftops. It was something he had never noticed before. There were shingled rooftops, flat rooftops, angled rooftops, and even rooftops with flimsy colored cloths as roofs. If it weren't for his ninja skills, he would have fallen straight through at least 5 of them. After making it through the obstacle course of village rooftops, he reached the base of the wall at last. The pale beige obstacle loomed over him and it seemed to be a worthy barrier standing between him and freedom, but it would not defeat him. With one huge leap, he jumped onto the side and used his chakra to start running up the wall. He took long strides, trying to get over the wall as quickly as possible. The last thing he needed was to be spotted, although he was pretty sure the cover of the night would help a lot in that aspect. Within a few seconds, he was at the top of the wall and it didn't take him long to start vaulting down the other side. As he landed, the sights, sounds, and smells of the village disappeared. The busy lighted food stands were replaced with green trees darkened by the night, the sound of the bustling crowds was replaced by the silence of the dark forest before him, and the smells were no longer of grilled food but of damp earth and fallen leaves. The lack of light now painted the forest in dim grayscale. If it weren't for the moon illuminating a few small patches of green, it would be unrecognizable, such was the power of the night. Naruto glanced left and right, then tried to sense out the surrounding area to see if any scouts were nearby, a couple, but not close enough to be a threat. Setting his focus in the direction of the hot water, he took a deep breath. Time to do this. Was he insane? Out of his mind? Totally mental? Probably all of the above, but thinking is overrated. A few dying leaves whirled around under his feet as he broke into a mad dash towards freedom, the trees passing by in a blur. While he was running, the fox's voice came to him once more, "Take to the trees and stay there." The trees? Yeah, and try not to break the branches you land on? Exceptional genin, that was the team composition Shikamaru had been reduced to, and on his first mission as a chunin nonetheless. This was such a drag. The fact that it wasn't even an ordinary mission made it worse. This was a mission to retrieve a rogue Sasuke Uchiha who most likely had help from Orochimaru's lackeys. Brilliant. He realized that asking for a group of 4 comprised of junins and or chunins might be been a bit much. But he wished that Tsunade had at least given him another chunin. Instead, she had sent him on his way telling him to gather exceptional genin, and then requested that his first pick be Naruto of all people. Shikamaru realized Naruto had talent, but he personally wouldn't have picked the hothead, especially since he was so close to the concerned party. Unfortunately, Tsunade was the one calling the shots, so he just had to roll with it. As he arrived at Naruto's apartment, he remarked that the lights were still off inside. It was so early in the morning that it was still dark out, which meant the idiot was probably still asleep. He twisted his pinky around in his ear, then knocked against the brown wooden door 3 times. Waking people up was such a drag, especially since he didn't like it when people did it to him, but sometimes, duty called. After waiting for an answer and hearing no movement inside, he knocked once more, louder this time. He had actually heard stories of Naruto being a surprisingly light sleeper, so he expected a rather quick answer. Unfortunately, it seemed like the opposite was true. He heaved a heavy sigh, then pounded on the door once more and reached down, shaking the doorknob in frustration, much to his surprise. The door was unlocked, and with the slightest push of his fingers, it creaked open. Light from an outside lantern crept into the small slit of the open door before he turned on the light cautiously. This was strange. The place was clean, so clean that there wasn't even the usual roach running away in panic. It didn't smell like instant ramen was cooked into the walls either. Odd. He was used to Naruto's place being a dump by now, so finding a clean apartment was an unexpected, albeit welcome, surprise. The clean apartment was a bit suspicious though, so he decided it would be best to just scope out the inside first. Arming himself with a kunai in hand, he did a quick sweep of the apartment. No one in any of the other rooms. Just a clean apartment. Maybe Naruto had gone out for some reason, but why would he go out this late at night? Or this early in the morning, since it was technically a new day? Whichever way you looked at it, it didn't make sense. Shikamaru scanned the room once more, looking for any clue as to where he may have gone. As his eyes moved from the bedroom to the kitchen, they were drawn to the kitchen table. It was immaculately clean except for a yellow pencil and a little notebook with a faded blue cover that rested on one corner of the table. They were out of place. He squinted at the oddly placed objects, then walked over to them. The pencil was old, and its worn-out sides left small chips of yellow residue on his fingers. The notebook hadn't fared any better against the corroding powers of time. The bindings were bent, the pages had aged, and the once vibrant blue cover was now pale against the dim light. He examined it with a bit of intrigue before opening it and starting to flip through the discolored yellow pages. The first few pages contained some of Naruto's work from the academy along with a few random doodles. It was old and smeared, but Shikamaru could recognize those scratchy scribbles from a mile away. The doodles were mainly of fanciful things like fire-breathing dragons and overgrown foxes. But every now and then, there would be some more down-to-earth things like clouds or trees. People seemed to be a subject of Naruto's doodles as well. Especially teachers, and it was obvious which ones Naruto found boring. Their mouths were always drawn in a comical fashion and their bodies were no different. Some of them looked like they could swallow a watermelon whole and others looked like they were having a hernia. Shikamaru thought they were pretty funny doodles, to be honest. And a small part of him hoped that Naruto had drawn some of their classmates, just to see what they'd look like. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to be the case. Well, except for a few doodles of a certain pink-haired kunoichi. The doodles of her weren't as funny as the other ones though, she never had any distortions. Go figure. Shikamaru couldn't help but give a small smirk at the sight. If only they could go back to those innocent days at the academy. Those days before Orochimaru's assault and Sasuke's desertion and life-threatening missions. With a sigh, he returned to flipping through the notebook pages and searching for clues. Most of the pages he came across were blank, but he kept flipping through them all the same. No stone left unturned. It was fortunate that he did, for it wasn't long before a flash of letters flew by. Pausing briefly, he used 2 fingers to delicately flip backward until he reached the page that had been passed. This page had writing on it and it was fresh, maybe even as recent as today. To my friends, hey everyone, I didn't feel like it would be right for me to just leave without saying anything, so I decided to write this kinda on the spot before I left. It's gonna be kinda short since I am low on time, but at least it's something, yeah. I know a lot of you are probably going to be shocked to hear that I left. To be honest, I think that's my fault. I always go around wearing this bright smile, but after reading this letter, I am sure you all can tell it wasn't real, at least not most of the time. I grew up as a loner, so smiling just came naturally. It didn't matter if I was having a bad day or anything, I just wanted people to know I could take care of myself. So I smiled and hoped they would believe that everything was okay. I think it worked for the most part. I hope you all don't blame yourselves for this. I had my problems long before I became friends with any of you. The truth is that I've thought about this before, leaving I mean. Maybe for a few days, weeks, months, years, maybe never coming back at all. I think that now I just finally worked up the courage to do it. Now that I think back, I think I always liked the thought of being a runaway. To be able to go somewhere where nobody knew me and live a different life. A life where I wasn't the class clown or the noisy prankster you know. I hope I can come back one day, but until then, please don't come after me. It would only make things worse than they already are. There's something I am trying to do, and this is how I've chosen to do it. Please respect that. I wish I could make this sound better, but I can't. So, I guess this is goodbye, at least for now. Naruto Uzumaki. It took Shikamaru less than 5 seconds to realize what he was reading, and when he did, he felt a very unsettling chill come over his body. A chill so disturbing it eventually seeped into his bones. Gray eyes narrowed against the discolored paper and chapped lips parted halfway. Suddenly, he could feel his heart beating, each thump more erratic than the one before. Impossible. His thin eyebrows furrowed as he concentrated and read through every single word written on the paper he was holding. He read it again, one more time to be sure it was real. Another chill ran through his body as he realized it was. Naruto left? The words echoed off the recesses of his mind as he stood in the middle of the kitchen, paralyzed by disbelief. The concept still felt foreign to him. How could the energetic hothead, who sometimes seemed like he could take anything and bounce back 20 times stronger, desert the village? What the hell was going on? First Sasuke and now Naruto. What was next? Sakura? Maybe Kakashi for good measure? One hand reached up to massage his forehead as the other steadied him against the table. He let his eyelids fall shut as he desperately tried to recollect himself. Slow deep breaths. What was the next rational step? What would a Chunin do? He didn't have to think very long to realize there was only one course of action to take. He had to tell Tsunade. She'd have to make the next call. He tightened his grip on the blue notebook and bolted out the door, slamming it behind him. This situation was getting more troublesome by the second. Shikamaru burst through the double doors of the Hokage office with his chest quickly rising and falling due to his full-blown run back to the office. You would think such a dramatic entrance would grab the attention of everyone in the room. But not so. His arrival went completely unacknowledged as Tsunade was having a not-so-friendly discussion with a man whose face was half covered in bandages. Shikamaru had never seen him before, but he could tell that he was getting under her skin. If the furrowed eyebrows weren't an indicator, the way she was leaning over her desk was. She only leaned over it that way when she was super annoyed, like now. Sasuke Uchiha cannot be allowed to reach Orochimaru, the man stated, pounding his cane into the ground as he spoke. I know that, Tsunade responded through gritted teeth. I told you, I've already got a team on it. And I told you that a group of genin hardly qualifies as a team. Well, the village is low on resources since Orochimaru's attack, Tsunade stated matter-of-factly, so we're just gonna have to do with what we've got. That's not good enough. Well, if you ever become Hokage, maybe you can do better. The Mont's one visible eye narrowed as he gripped his cane tighter. Perhaps you need a lesson in better handling your resources. Perhaps you need to shut up. After those words left Tsunade's mouth, a disturbing silence fell over the room, and it wasn't long before the two adults were staring each other to pieces. Poor Shikamaru had to stand in the background watching, even though he so badly wanted to turn around and leave. The way they were staring at each other was unsettling, and the air was charged with enough electricity to rival Kakashi's Chidori. Talk about a clash of titans. What the hell had he walked in on? Scratch that. He probably didn't want to know. Not wanting to risk another explosion, he cleared his throat and took the lull of silence as an opportunity to cut into the charged atmosphere. Sorry to interrupt, he said, walking into the room as if on eggshells. When he reached Tsunade's desk, he gave a short bow and straightened up as he waited to be acknowledged. Tsunade finally managed to tear her eyes away from the man she was arguing with and said, "It's fine, what's the problem?" This, he said, handing her the open notebook with a frown. Tsunade took the notebook from him and held it a few inches from her face to read it. He could see her bring it closer to her face as she read more, a mirror image of his reaction. It took her less than 30 seconds to speed through the letter, but he could tell it was taking her a lot longer to register that it was real. Furrowed eyebrows, deep breaths, sharper exhales. She was trying to understand, much like he did when he first found the letter, but he could tell that her logic was failing her. She couldn't understand it, no matter how she tried. His lips formed a grim line as he looked away. No amount of sake was fixing this. Suddenly, Tsunade's posture straightened as she tucked a strand of stray hair behind her ear. He could swear that same hand wiped away a tear too. "Get your team ready to go after Sasuke," she said. But what about Naruto? The view of a sunrise from the Hokage monument was just one of those sights that never got old. It was worth waking up just that tad bit earlier if it meant getting to watch the tip of the sun come into view on the horizon. The rising sun painted the village in an ethereal orange glow. The smell of fresh dew tickled your nose, and if you waited long enough, you could even feel the sun's rays warming you as it chased away the night. It was truly a sight to behold, but Jiraiya was there for a different view. This was clearly evidenced by the overused pair of binoculars drooped around his neck and the fact that his perching spot on top of the fourth Hokage's head conveniently had a view of the women's hot springs. Sure, it was probably a couple of miles away, but that's what binoculars were for. Can't pound a guy if he's miles out of sight. The fact that he was so effectively beating the system had him grinning in positively perverted glee. They'd never see him coming. The downside to that was the fact that he was so far away. Tough, but whenever he got anywhere near a bathhouse, he usually came out with a few bruises, so he'd keep his distance for now. Another downside of researching the hot springs was that stupid steam vapors always made it hard to see if the focus was right on his binoculars, and that just wouldn't do at all, especially when there were so many beautiful subjects to catalog. His mind floated back to a wonderful brunette he had a date with about a week ago. Well, it was a little one-sided, but still, in any case, he had done some more digging and found out she'd be at the hot springs again this morning. It was only a matter of time. In the meantime, there were still various subjects to catalog. Like that stunning redhead who walked in a few moments ago. She was out of focus, but you didn't need focus to admire that bod. Beautiful, bath towel clad, and oh so close to being the next victim of Jiraiya's researching campaign. With a perverted grin, he slowly spun the focusing ring on the binoculars to sharpen the blurry image. Sure, it was a little hazy at first, but it wasn't long before the porcelain-colored skin started fading into view. Just above the towel were the soft curves of a bare shoulder, and below the towel were even smoother legs. Cue the Cheshire Cat grin. Beating the system indeed. When she started removing her towel, he felt a small trail of blood wet his mustache. Unfortunately for him, a dark green waistband stepped in front of his binoculars before he could see any more. "Hey!" he yelled, dropping the binoculars to find himself face to face with Tsunade. "Oh. What were you doing?" she asked, her face set harder than stone. Just a little bird watching," he replied, scratching the back of his neck. "You're lucky we've got bigger problems to deal with right now." "Bird watching isn't that hard to beat," he said, chuckling awkwardly. "Stop joking for once in your life and tell me what you said to him yesterday." With an annoyed groan, Jiraiya dropped his binoculars and crossed his arms, realizing his plans for the morning had officially been derailed. "What are you talking about?" he drawled. I am talking about Naruto. Kakashi said you were gonna talk to him after his little scuffle with Sasuke. Oh, that, Jiraiya replied, looking away into the village. I didn't say anything. What do you mean you didn't say anything? Tsunade half yelled with both hands on her hips. Jiraiya gave a shrug and replied, the kid looked bad enough as it was, he needed some space. Tsunade's hand shot up to massage her temple as she replied through gritted teeth, Kakashi said he told you to talk to him. Alright, I get it, geez, why are you biting my head off? Because of this, Jiraiya, she said, practically shoving the notebook into his chest. Jiraiya paused briefly before taking hold of the pale blue notebook and focusing on the handwritten letter before him. It didn't take him long to read it, but the world seemed to slow to a standstill when he did. For once, he had been left completely speechless. There was no uproar of laughter, no stream of corny jokes, just silence, and all he could do was stand motionless as the last traces of remnant heat left his body. In the absence of heat came terrible cold. The type of cold that drifts through your clothes then seeps through your skin, relentlessly continuing its course until it finally reaches your bones and leaves you numb. The first sign of him leaving his stupor was a small squint. Turning to her, he asked, where did you find this? I didn't, she replied. Shikamaru found it when I sent him to get Naruto a few moments ago. What was Shikamaru doing getting Naruto? Sasuke went rogue too. What? Tsunade's shoulders lifted in a lifeless shrug as she answered. Apparently, Sakura tried to stop him, but he just knocked her out and left. Her eyes lost some of their light as she continued. Jiraiya. Everything is falling apart. We don't even have any ninja to spare because the village is still reeling from Orochimaru's attack. I mean, Sasuke I could see coming, but this, she finished, swallowing a bit as her eyes started glazing over. As the tears started forming, Jiraiya couldn't help but tear his eyes away. How could he look at her when the tears resting in her eyes were his fault? He had one job, just the one, and he had somehow managed to screw it up. Jiraiya the Gallant, a ninja revered in his time and known as one of the legendary Sannin, now looking more like a professional screw-up than anything. What's Kakashi doing about this? He finally asked, eyes never leaving the village. He's on a day-long mission from the daimyo. He won't be back until tomorrow. So, who's leading the mission to get back Sasuke? Shikamaru and a group of hand-picked genin. Jiraiya exhaled. That's not good, we don't have a choice. There was a noticeable pause after those words, and the only sound to break the silence was the whistle of a soft breeze as it passed through the monument rocks. Both Sannin stood motionless, basking in the glow of the rising sun. Despite the nagging quiet, they knew each other's thoughts intimately. They had been in some crazy situations, fought some tough battles, and come out on top over some impossible odds, but this was still a big one. Jiraiya broke the silence as he handed the notebook back. I am gonna track Naruto. Tsunade's eyes never met his. They were too taken by the endless world she saw looming in the distance. Silently, she said, we don't even know which way he went or how long he's been gone. Jiraiya was quick to respond. He was here yesterday, so he can't have gone far. I'll track him with the toads, and if that doesn't pan out, I've always got my spy network. He's just a kid, he has to have left some type of trail. I hope you are right, I'll bring him back, Jiraiya said firmly. Tsunade nodded in response, but the way she solemnly looked towards the horizon showed that she had her doubts. Doubts he knew would keep her up at night. She'd let them consume her and gnaw away at her soul until there was nothing left. They'd destroy her, from the inside. He knew this for a very simple reason. It was the same thing that would happen to him, so that was his mission, bring back the kid, for both their sakes. Not long after that, he turned away, rubbing the bridge of his nose and burying a small sniffle of his own. It would probably be best if he got to work now. He had a feeling it was going to be a long day. As he turned to leave, he heard Tsunade call his name once more. His response was a slight glance over his shoulder. Move quickly, she said. There's some guy who's been staying in the village for quite some time and it seems like he has history with the elders. What, you think he's gonna be a problem? I am not sure, but he was in the room when I found out about Sasuke's departure and I am pretty sure he's not gonna keep it to himself for very long. Does he know about Naruto? Well, he was there when Shikamaru brought the letter back, so he knows something's up. I can't say how much he knows though. Jiraiya paused, squinting as he mulled over the information. Today was the day that just kept on giving, wasn't it? All right, he said. What's his name? Danzo Shimura. Danzo. Yeah, Tsunade replied, giving a wary glance. You know him? Jiraiya's reply was an annoyed groan and an even more annoyed sigh. How long has he been here? Well, he showed up right after Orochimaru's invasion, claiming he was here for Hiruzen's funeral. Problem is he hasn't left since. Yeah, I'll bet he hasn't. What do you mean? Danzo used to be a trusted member of the council. What? Yeah, problem was his methods were extreme. He used to try to go against Hiruzen's orders all the time. Sometimes he even got the elders to back him up. Hiruzen tolerated it, until the Uchiha massacre. That was him? Tsunade asked, eyes widening at the realization. Yeah, Hiruzen kicked him off the council right after. Him being back now can only mean trouble. Now that Hiruzen's dead, he's probably trying to crawl his way back into his position. That weasel, yeah, I know, Jiraiya said, one hand rubbing his chin as he continued. I am gonna need you to buy me as much time as you can. I figured, Tsunade replied. I'll do what I can. Jiraiya nodded and turned away. Both nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, letting the cool air invade his being. One last whiff of Konoha. It smelled like spring, fresh, light, airy. There was no telling when he'd get to smell it again, so he did his best to memorize the smell and hoped it would stick with him. Eventually, he exhaled. With that, he jumped off the monument, deftly hopping from rock to rock as he made his way towards the outskirts of the village. Tsunade watched his leaping form until he disappeared down the side of the Hokage monument. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she whispered into the cold morning air, "Bring him home." Steeling herself, she turned on her heel to begin her descent down the mountain. She hadn't taken 2 steps when she spotted Shizune bounding up the monument steps, skipping a few steps here and there. By the time she finally arrived at the top, she was breathless. "Lady Tsunade," she said, bowing forward slightly and catching her breath. "What's wrong?" "The council has called a meeting." Tsunade looked down into the village as her eyes narrowed. "So it starts." LLL as Jiraiya jumped off of the last set of rocks on his way down. He bit into his thumb to draw the blood necessary before slamming his hand into the ground. Thin black markings shot outwards as the summon activated, bringing a small band of tracker toads to his feet in a puff of smoke. The toads were a distinct orange color and had green markings lining their skin. The one at the forefront was slightly bigger than the others and the obvious leader of the army. All of them looked at Jiraiya expectantly, their round eyes blinking in random intervals. "All right," he began, "we've got a situation." "What is it, boss?" the older toad asked. Naruto left the village. The statement was enough to start a small commotion among the frogs as a mix of questions and disgruntled croaks started traveling through the group. "What happened?" the eldest toad finally asked. "I don't really have time to explain," Jiraiya replied, "but as you all can see, I am gonna need your help." "Yeah, you got it, boss. Now, we don't know where he's headed, so the first thing I am gonna need you all to do is pick up on his trail. I know covering every direction away from the village is a lot to ask, but do you think you guys can do it in a timely manner?" "Sure thing," the toad replied. "We'll pick up the trail in no time." "Good," Jiraiya said. "When you do, meet me back at this spot." "I hear ya. Hey," he rasped towards all of the toads behind him, "let's move out." A multitude of wide toad heads bounced up and down in agreement then, one by one, they were hopping off in a different direction. So far, Naruto was really enjoying this rogue thing. In all honesty, he had never felt more alive. The farther away he got from the village, the more he could feel the raw adrenaline coursing through his veins. There was this overwhelming thrill that came from facing the unknown. Of course, there was a bit of apprehension there too, but he found that it was almost completely overridden by his adventurous drive. He had nowhere to go, but everywhere. It was exhilarating and a tad bit frightening at the same time. It was a kind of mystery that he was still trying to make sense of, but he decided not to linger on it for too long. Thinking wasn't his forte after all. Much easier to just focus on the thrill of his new situation. Heck, with the high he was feeling at the moment, he felt like he could take on anything. Now, that wasn't to say that going rogue didn't have its downsides. Traveling all night meant his jumpsuit was currently drenched in sweat, which felt gross even by his standards, and the scenery hadn't helped any either. At night, everything was painted in dim grays and whites. And in the day the rays of sunshine struggled to even get past the leaves of the trees overhead. The result was him having to look at nothing but dull greens and browns so far. Everywhere he looked, there were simply trees, big trees, Small trees, dead trees, tree stumps. Boring. The smell didn't change much either. Whiffs of damp earth and dry shrubs seemed to be all the forest had to offer. He was not impressed, as far as sounds went. Birds seemed to be the spice of life. They were actually getting quite annoying now that he thought about it. How many times did you have to sing the same song before it got old? They weren't even cool birds like eagles or hawks or falcons. They were just your average, everyday forest variety bird. If Shikamaru were here, he would say they were a drag. Naruto smiled a bit at the thought and found his mind wandering back to his former home for a while. There were many things to think about when it came to Konoha. But he didn't allow his mind to stay there long enough to go down that path. Instead, he shook his head violently and tried to keep his mind focused elsewhere. The forest was, of course, the only other thing he could easily turn his attention to, so he once again considered criticizing the living daylights out of it. It was an appealing thought, but in the end, he decided against it. He really shouldn't be complaining too much. Brooding was more Sasuke's thing, and beggars can't be choosers. After all, maybe this was just a part of being a rogue he'd have to get used to. All right, the fox said. Stop here. What for? Naruto asked as he perched on the branch he had stopped on. You've been going since the middle of the night. You need to stay hydrated. There's a stream nearby. A stream? Naruto asked. How do you know? First lesson, the fox replied. Always pay attention to what your senses are telling you. My senses, Naruto whispered as he tried to make sense of the statement. Your ears in particular, the fox said, throwing him a bone. Naruto squinted, then let his eyes fall shut as he listened. What he was listening for, he did not know, but there were more sounds than he noticed at first. Besides the obvious bird songs he couldn't seem to get out of his head, there were other things. Tree leaves swaying in the wind. Wind currents passing through rocks. An animal rustling the leaves in a brush. The gentle trickle of a nearby stream. Naruto's eyes shot open at the realization. I hear it, he whispered, turning to look in the direction that the faint sound was coming from. It's barely there, but I hear it. Yeah, the fox replied. You'll be surprised what you hear when you stop to listen. Now try this. Naruto squinted, but before he could say anything, familiar red chakra started bubbling out of every pore of his skin. In an instant, the trickle of the stream sounded as if it were right next to him. Whoa, he breathed. That's awesome. Yeah, and useful, the fox replied as the cloak started retreating from Naruto's body. The red bubbles were halfway gone when they stopped abruptly. What's wrong? Naruto asked. Do you feel that? The fox asked, his voice conveying an urgency that Naruto didn't understand. Feel what? Powerful chakras, the fox replied, to the west. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he turned towards the east, trying to sense what the fox was sensing. It took him a couple of seconds and a bit of focus, but he sensed them, 5 distinct chakra signatures, each one ominous in its own chill-inducing way. One of them was familiar, but they were too far away for him to place. After looking off in their direction for a while longer, he silently asked, They're not coming for me, are they? The fox's reply was equally silent. I don't know, that doesn't make me feel better, fox. The fox remained silent and Naruto felt like time had come to a standstill. They couldn't be after him, could they? He had been gone for all of 2 seconds. There was no way someone was already that close to him. If anything, they should just now be finding out he's gone. Well, they're not moving towards us, the fox said. Maybe they have their own destination. So, what do? We stop here, the fox replied. If they keep going, we know we're in the clear. If not, get ready for a fight. Naruto stared in their direction for a while before whispering to himself, what the hell have I gotten myself into? Just try not to think about it, the fox said. Head to the stream. Well, camp there for a bit. It was cold today, so cold that Sakura could see the mist of her breath dancing in front of her face every now and then. Were mornings always like this? She couldn't remember anymore. The past used to be so clear. But now, it all seemed to blur into a messy muddle of memories. Ironically, the one memory that was still clear in her mind was the one memory she wished she could forget. It was last night, when he left. She would give the world to make that memory go away, but she knew she was stuck with it, maybe for life. She hugged her form a little tighter as she walked, eventually rubbing her hands along her arms in an attempt to rub away some goosebumps. It was really cold. After a few more minutes of walking in silence, she lifted her head to see that the village gate was just now looming into view. Shikamaru was supposed to be leading a team of genin on a mission to retrieve Sasuke, so she wanted to see if she could be of help on some off chance. She wasn't counting on it, but she just wanted a chance to do something, anything really, to be useful in some way. Shikamaru stood against the hard bark of a tree with his pinky twirling in his ear as he lazily examined the three-man group standing in front of him. He hoped with everything he had that they were enough, mainly because he didn't want to think about what it would mean if they weren't. The group was comprised of Neji Hyuga, Shoji Akamichi, and Kiba Inuzuka, and by default Akamaru. Not exactly the Chunin group he had asked for, but it was something. At least he had a variety of skill sets at his disposal. Sighing, he asked, "Everyone ready?" The usually animated replies were replaced with mellow nods, and even the usually talkative Kiba had fallen silent. Shikamaru examined the team, noting the slight shift in behavior, then turned away. At least they understood the stakes. "All right," he said, pushing himself off the tree, "let's get moving." They hadn't taken 2 steps when he noticed Sakura approaching out of the corner of his eye. An involuntary groan escaped his lips and both eyes visibly drooped. The whole night had been troublesome, and it looked like the morning had no intention of being any different. Regardless, he forced himself to meet her halfway and even tried not to look too annoyed while he did it. She had been through a lot, after all. When they were finally a few feet from each other, he grabbed the first word. "I already know what you're gonna say, Sakura, but you couldn't stop him last night. The only way he's coming back is by force, and I know you are not willing to do that. Won't you guys at least need a 5th member?" she pleaded, tears already filling her eyes. "Don't take this the wrong way, but even if I felt we needed a 5th member, I still wouldn't take you. You're not a combat type, and besides that, you're too close to this, so you're a casualty." His voice was cold, just like the morning air. "What about Naruto?" she asked, spite creeping into her voice. "You guys are keeping him out of this too, aren't you?" "What, is he too close too?" "What?" Shikamaru replied, "Of course not, then why isn't he here?" Shikamaru paused considering the answer, then looked away. As his eyes fell on the forest ahead, he whispered to himself, "I never got the chance to tell him." "What?" Sakura asked. Shikamaru paused briefly, then said, "Nothing," shrugging off the statement. Sakura looked away with still watery eyes and said, "Well, there's no way he wouldn't be here otherwise." "You'd be surprised. What does that mean?" she retorted. "Yeah," Kiba added. "Where is the loudmouth anyway? If he knew, we'd have to tie him up to stop him from coming with us." Shikamaru looked at Kiba, then glanced at everyone else. Unsurprisingly, they were all staring back. They looked like they wanted answers and like they were expecting him to be the one to give them some. All he could do was sigh. He really hated times like these. Those awkward moments when you were the only one who knew a very important bit of information that almost no one else knew about. The type of information that could shake up life as you knew it and literally shatter a person. And of course, it was up to you to decide whether you were gonna reveal said information or not. Premium drag material. Unfortunately, his promotion to Chunin seemed to be leading into these situations more and more. First, that bandaged creep at the Hokage's office, and now this. He had hoped to keep Naruto's departure secret from the team to keep them focused, but now Sakura was broaching the subject at 100 miles an hour. How troublesome. "Look," he said, making sure to measure his next words carefully, "there's a lot going on that you don't know about." "What does that even mean?" Sakura asked, clearly exasperated at this point. She was very quickly followed up by Neji, who Shikamaru noticed now had his arms crossed. "I do not wish to be disrespectful," he began, "but I also find Naruto not being here quite odd." "Yeah, are we missing something?" Shoji asked. Shikamaru exhaled, then lifted his head to the sky and watched as the clouds floated by. They were peaceful. He wished he was one right now. Heck, at this rate, he wouldn't mind being one for the rest of his life. But, alas, they were up there, and he was down here. That was just how it was. A part of him wondered if they ever wanted to be like him in some respect. It was an interesting thought, but he couldn't give it much credit. Who would want to have his life? It was way too complicated. Much better to float around all day without a care in the world. With a sigh, he let his head fall back to the earth and decided to do the one thing that would make his life a whole lot simpler. Long story short, Naruto was supposed to be on this mission, but he also left last night, so he's not. The moment those words left his mouth, he noticed that a certain stillness fell over everyone's movements and the only visible motion came from Neji, whose arms had uncrossed and fallen to his sides. After a chill-inducing moment of awkward silence, Sakura silently asked, "What do you mean he left?" "The village," Shikamaru replied, scratching his head near the ponytail. "He left the village." Shikamaru noticed that as soon as those words left his mouth, Sakura's eyes went so wide that they could have rolled right out of her head. Within seconds, her breathing had also quickened, so much so that he could now see each puff of misty breath disappear quicker than the one before it. Before long, her chest was rising and falling dangerously, and as the life drained from her features, he could tell she was unraveling right in front of him. Before she was fully undone, he looked away, a small part of him wondering if maybe he should have kept things to himself after all. "Like, with Sasuke?" Choji asked. "No," Shikamaru replied. "From what we can see, he's on his own." "As in he went rogue?" Neji asked, disbelief apparent in his voice. "Looks that way. Then why the hell are we going after Sasuke?" Kiba yelled. "Screw his dumb ass. He's had it out for us since the academy." "This isn't up for debate," Shikamaru stated. "Tsunade is taking care of Naruto. We have orders, we're following them." "You're lying." All eyes turned towards the pink-haired Kunoichi who had just spoken. Fresh tears lined the corners of her eyes, and they were not alone. There was something else lingering in those pale green eyes, something unsettling. By now, her lips were set into a grim line and her face had lost all color. Despite the unsettling changes to her appearance, her breathing was unnervingly calm. Sakura Shikamaru started. "You're a liar," she yelled, running back into the village with tears flying from her eyes. Shikamaru watched her run, and run, and run. Where she was running to, he had no idea, but he didn't stop her, he just watched her with his usual lazy stare. Maybe she wanted to see the truth for herself, or maybe she thought she could outrun it somehow. Either way, he knew she'd be disappointed. Searching for the truth would just confirm the reality, and running from it would be a sad attempt at delaying the inevitable. This wasn't just some nightmare you could wake up from, heck. He wished it were that simple, but it wasn't. This was real. Very real, and the sooner they all accepted that, the sooner they could figure out how to deal with it. It hadn't taken him too long to realize that, but he had his doubts about how soon she'd come to grips with things. Normally, he would classify that as none of his concern, but as her distressed form disappeared behind a street corner, he found himself hoping it was sooner rather than later. For her sake, with a final exhale, he turned back to his team. "Anyone else got something to say?" He assumed they could see how tired he was of everything because neither of them said a word. Good. Maybe he'd have some peace and quiet for a bit. Those things seemed to be in short supply nowadays. Both hands fell into his pockets as he turned away from the team and looked towards the open world before them. "Let's go." It was probably too late to go back to being a genin, right? Jiraiya stood with his arms crossed over his chest as he stared into the forest looming in front of him. It was calm for the most part, only disturbed by the occasional gust of wind. The leaves would rustle together and sway to one side, and he would count the seconds before they fell back into their original position. He had hoped that watching the dancing trees would have a calming effect on his inner turmoil. But there was no change. It seemed the morning's revelations were too heavy to be forgotten. Even if for a moment, he had already made a trip to Naruto's apartment and found absolutely no clue as to where he had gone. So he had no choice but to return to where he started. The toads weren't finished yet, so all he could do was wait. And wait, and wait. It had barely been 5 minutes. But it felt like an eternity. Every second spent here meant Naruto was getting farther away, and he hated that. He tried to think about other things to pass the time, but nothing really held his attention. All he could think about was that young boy he met so long ago and the memories they would come to share. Memories of ruined expeditions and stubborn water balloons and finished popsicle sticks. How things had come to this, he had no idea, but what he did know was that that same boy was somewhere out there, alone, and he needed to be found. His contemplative trance was broken when he spotted the toad leader hop next to his feet out of the corner of his eye. Turning to him, he asked, "What did you find?" "We picked up the trail that away," he rasped, pointing a spiny toad finger in the appropriate direction. "Is it strong?" "Yeah, there's plenty of life left in it. Some of the guys are already ahead." Jiraiya nodded, then turned his gaze to the forest in front of him. It loomed over him, taunting him with its vastness and mystery. But he would not be intimidated. His eyes were focused, Sharp, resolute, he was a man on a mission, and this was a mission he could not fail. His eyes fell shut and his nostrils flared once more as he took in a deep breath, absorbing the surrounding smells into his being. He was hoping to get one last whiff of Konoha, but the scent eluded him. In its place, he found the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. Well, it was a long shot anyway. "All right," he said, "let's get to work." The small rotating fan attached to the ceiling was supposed to have two functions: cool the room down and provide a source of light. It was currently failing at both. Saying the room was dimly lit would be an understatement. And saying the fan was even remotely lowering the room temperature would be a flat-out lie. The singular light bulb was adequate, but it barely gave off enough light to light the room. The fan was no different, seeing as the slow-spinning blades made sure the room never got any proper circulation. Over time, the air in the room would even develop a certain stale quality to it. It was quite unsettling. Unfortunately, this was the normal state of the council meeting room. And the tense meetings that were held there just made it worse, meetings much like the one being held right now. Tsunade hated them with a passion, and today was no different. With how things were going, she could feel her blood pressure rising, and she didn't even try to hide the scowl that came as a result of what she was hearing. Once again, the elders had a stupid idea, and she was forced to entertain it as she precariously leaned over the rectangular meeting table that had become the bane of her existence. At the opposite end of the table stood Danzo with his right arm in a cast and his left hand resting peacefully on his cane. He seemed to be unfazed by her scowl, although the same could not be said for the village elders, Koharu and Homura. They were both sitting on the long side of the table and avoided her gaze while sitting in a way that made them look stiffer than flagpoles. Pathetic. At least if you are gonna do something, have the backbone to stick with it. Tsunade let out a calming breath, then asked, "Whose idea was this?" "It doesn't matter," Danzo replied. "What's important is for us to act in the best interests of the village." "And that means sending for the rogue hunter?" "Under these circumstances, yes," Homura replied. "His methods are violent," Tsunade argued. "Crude, effective," Danzo added. "Why are you even here?" she asked. "You're supposed to be visiting the village, not trying to run it." Koharu replied before Danzo could. "Danzo is only here because he brought the current situation to our attention." Her eyes narrowed as she continued. "Something you apparently couldn't be bothered to do." Tsunade sighed, balling her hands into fists on the table. "As Hokage, I made a judgment call. I didn't have time to relay the information because I had to act." "And we respect your right to make those calls as Hokage," Homura replied soothingly. "But giving a genin team a mission of this caliber is questionable." Tsunade could tell he was trying to mitigate things, but, as usual, he was trying to play it safe with both sides. Typical, and still pathetic. "Those were my sentiments exactly," Danzo added, "which is why I think the rogue hunter is a reasonable option. If we can't send out our own ninja, then a bounty hunter is the next reasonable alternative." Tsunade sighed, then said, "Not only is the idea extreme, it's completely unnecessary. I've already spoken to Jiraiya and he's going after Naruto. Surely, one of the legendary Sannin is skilled enough to track down a genin." With the new information came a brief respite from the brewing conflict. Homura and Koharu began whispering to each other while Danzo remained silent. His body was almost a mirror image of a statue, but the way his gaze came to rest on the table gave him away. He was thinking, about what exactly, Tsunade did not know, but she had a feeling she wouldn't like it. When a few more seconds of silence had passed, Danzo lifted his head and broke into the silence. "This is an interesting development, but, unfortunately, we've already sent for him." The dimly lit room fell silent for the umpteenth time, and Tsunade could barely feel her reply leave her lips. "You did what?" Why, you must understand," Hamaru began. "You sent a genin team after Sasuke. We didn't expect you to send a Sannin after Naruto." "We feared the loss of the Jinchuriki," Koharu added. "The elders are right," Danzo echoed. "What would we tell the other nations if they found out we had lost the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki? There would be no way of explaining our lack of diligence. Now, if you had let us know about Jiraiya beforehand." Tsunade cut him off with a sardonic chuckle. "Just like that, huh? Acting behind one Hokage's back wasn't enough." That statement was enough to silence Homura and Koharu, and Tsunade noticed that even Danzo had sported the slightest of flinches. "Yeah, I know all about your part in the Uchiha massacre," she said, casting a pointed stare at Danzo. "All of you," she finished. looking towards Homura and Kaharu. You guys are so bent on doing what you all think is right that you'll go through anyone in your way, even if they're the Hokage. There was a brief silence before Danzo cleared his throat and said, "The past is irrelevant, what matters is protecting Konoha's future." "Yeah," Tsunade said, raising an eyebrow. "Real convenient for you, isn't it?" Danzo squinted, then adjusted his grip on his cane. "If we're talking about the past, then maybe you'd like to explain your prior reputation as a prolific gambler and alcoholic." There was a brief pause as the words registered with Tsunade, but when they did, it looked like all hell was about to break loose. In a split second, her fists were balled up and her body had tensed up to the point where it was clear she was halfway to jumping across the table. "You slimy little..." Let's refrain from insulting each other," Homura said, holding up a hand towards both concerned parties. Tsunade could feel the rage pouring out of her in waves. And if she was honest, she could have beat that man to a pulp and never changed a shade. Oh, it was tempting, so very tempting, but she held back for one reason and one reason alone. She refused to be the one to give him and his silver tongue any ammunition in his next sleazy endeavor. Next thing you know, news is out that the Hokage assaulted a former council member, so she stood there, staring across the table mercilessly, all the while curling and uncurling her fingers in an attempt to dissipate her rage. "You're out of line, Danzo." Tsunade's eyes flitted over to Kaharu, who had just made the statement, then back to Danzo, who was now looking at Kaharu as well. After a short pause, she finished, "Don't make us regret your presence here." Danzo looked down at her for a moment, then looked ahead to Tsunade. There was a short pause before he nodded slightly and gave a short bow. His voice had a certain oiliness to it as he spoke. "Kaharu is right. My words were insensitive, I apologize." There were a variety of things Tsunade wanted to say at the moment, but instead, she made the very wise choice of not saying anything and dropped into her chair. She needed some sake, cause if not she was gonna kill that man. Danzo used his cane as support and followed suit. Tsunade turned to the elders and asked, "When is he going to be here?" Her voice was cold and the blank slate that was her face made it was obvious that she no longer cared for what any of them had to say, not that she cared much before anyway. "Well, he was last spotted in one of the outlying villages," Homura replied hesitantly. "It depends on how fast the messenger hawk gets to him." "In other words, you don't know," Tsunade replied, face still blank. Homura looked down and mumbled, "No life." The forest teemed with it, from the dancing tree leaves to the abundant wildlife to the flowing streams. Every inch of the forest expressed its unparalleled beauty. On the ground, various insects crawled about, making their way through the ever-changing terrain, and in the air, brightly colored butterflies flew about from flower to flower, pollinating as they went. Birds, hares, fish, all living beings with a part to play. The birds were a sort of orchestra, and like it or not, they never quit their jobs. Faint chirps could be heard as one bird sung its song. And even fainter chirps resounded in the distance as other birds replied. The hares were different. They were quieter, quicker, nimbler, a certain type of tourist attraction that rewarded the attentive. Keep your eyes peeled and you may just spot this fleet-footed creature darting through a brush before burrowing its way down into its humble abode under a tree. But the real wonders to watch were the fish. One look in a stream would reveal a silver-scaled creature swimming freely, enjoying life in a different type of world, a world lurking just beneath the surface. There was a certain beauty in it all, and the way life radiated from everything echoed a quiet brilliance. It was nature in full force. Naruto for one was starting to appreciate it more and more. Now that he had stopped traveling, it was getting easier to see the beauty. He sat crouched on the edge of the riverbank, shirtless, and solemnly watching the water sparkle as it trickled through various sticks and stones. He had already taken a drink earlier, and although it wasn't the best water he'd ever tasted, he couldn't complain. After traveling for a whole night, just about any water tasted good. He had also taken a quick bath since the fox said it would knock people off his scent. No loose ends type of thing. His jumpsuit was currently drying off on a nearby tree branch, so he had thrown on some shorts and opted out of wearing a shirt. It was pretty hot out anyway. Cupping his hands, he splashed a handful of water onto his face. Sighing silently at its rejuvenating powers, he remained still for a moment, feeling content to let every drop sink into his pores before moving again. When he was satisfied, he trudged back to the tree his clothes were resting on and sat down. Leaning against the tree trunk, He had been playing a waiting game with those far-off chakra signatures and it looked like it might finally be over. His eyes glanced back in their direction as he spoke silently. It looks like they kept moving, I can't sense them anymore. Yeah, the fox replied, we should do the same. As soon as your clothes are dry, we head out. Got it, Naruto said, ruffling his still wet hair. So, what do I do in the meantime? Sit around and twiddle my thumbs. You should probably take a nap, you've been going since the middle of the night. Naruto shook his head. No can do, Fox, I haven't set up any traps and I definitely don't have the time to. If someone sneaks up on me, I am toast. With a squint, he added, I thought you were supposed to be the brains of this operation. I'll watch your back. And how exactly are you gonna do that? Naruto asked, looking up at his hair as he messed with two still wet blonde locks. It's actually pretty simple, the fox replied, just give me control of your body for a bit and my chakra will protect you. Something between a huff and a chuckle escaped Naruto's lips as he replied, I don't think I trust you that much yet. Slight shuffling was heard as the fox moved around in his chamber, even though I got you this far. Naruto thought about it for a bit, then shrugged the statement off, maybe you did, but I still don't really know you. The fox grumbled, eventually moving his head to rest on his paws, whatever. Hey, don't sound so grumpy, Naruto said, I am just looking out for my best interests. Touché, the fox said, grinning slightly. After a brief span of silence, he added, so, what's it gonna take for you to trust me? Naruto pondered, using one hand to start stroking his chin. Well, now that I think about it, I don't even know your name. I think that's a good start. I guess that's fair, the fox mumbled, my name is Kurama. Kurama, yeah, just not that many as. Okay, I gotcha, Naruto said, nodding, pretty cool name actually. You really think so? Yeah, I mean, all this time, I thought you didn't tell me cause you had some crappy name like Sasuke. A raspy chuckle echoed from the confines of Kurama's chamber before he shook his head and put his head back on his paws. You're something else, kid. Naruto smiled slightly then returned to messing with a few blonde locks, eventually twisting one over the other as he spoke. People don't usually laugh at my jokes. The fox replied, that one was relatively funny. Naruto couldn't resist a cheeky smile, maybe this little partnership of ours can work out after all. Before he could say anything else, he was greeted by a familiar but largely unwelcome sound. Grumble. Both eyes narrowed before dropping down to look at the offending organ. Well, that just wouldn't do at all. He gave his stomach a quick pat then said, all that traveling has me hungry, maybe I'll make some ramen. With what? Kurama asked. Well, I've already got water, he said, nodding towards the stream, I just need some firewood and. Wrong answer, the fox said, shaking his head, you can't start a fire out here kid, the smoke's gonna give you away, we're already on the lookout for those other chakras and there's no telling who else is out here. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that, Naruto said, scratching his head, so I'd have to wait till night. Yep, Naruto scratched his head harder, well, this is annoying, it's early morning, I can't just stay without food for a whole day. Well, you don't seem to need sleep so you shouldn't be too bad off. Haha, Naruto said, voice dripping with sarcasm, I don't want to starve. Well, then you should have packed something other than ramen. Naruto's face got stuck between an angry pout and a sneer as he pondered his reply. Well, maybe if the brains of the operation had suggested that, I would have done it. So now this is my fault. Yeah, he retorted, if you would have just made me pack a breakfast bar or something, this wouldn't be a problem. Now I am stuck out here in this mosquito-infested forest with nothing to eat and a big orange fox for company. Kurama leaned his head on one palm and rolled his eyes, just shut up and go pick some herbs or something. Easy for you to say, Naruto mumbled, you're not the one who's about to starve to death. Look, the forest has lots of fruits and different stuff you can eat, just find something you like, geez. Naruto considered the suggestion for a moment then sighed dramatically. Fine, he said, slowly rising from his sitting position. Crowds, thick flocks of people dressed in different colors, living different lives, and walking different paths. The streets of Konoha were home to many of them and Tsunade was currently in the throes of one. The crowd had materialized around her without her noticing, but she wasn't surprised. Sadness had a way of doing that to her. It would engulf her and leave her blind to what was happening around her. One moment, the streets carried an eerie silence and there was barely a soul in sight. The next, they were bustling with the shuffles and bumps of the morning rush. She inched her way through the crowd, rubbing shoulders with random people as she tried to snake through the swarm of busybodies. Her efforts were successful but slow, and in the end, she found her mind wandering to more pressing matters. She had gone to warn Jiraiya about the council's plans but found he was already gone. A part of her was glad he had already left. It meant he was that much closer to finding Naruto. But still, if someone like the Roga Hunter was really joining the hunt, so to speak, she needed to let Jiraiya know. Sending him a hawk later sounded like a good idea. As she walked further, the crowd slowly dwindled, and it wasn't long before she was completely alone. The dwindling crowd size wasn't surprising since she was heading into Naruto's neighborhood now. It was more on the rundown side of things, although it didn't look too bad at first glance. There were various buildings scattered around in various states of being. Some of them looked close to new while others looked like they were on the brink of collapse and others looked like they were stuck somewhere in between. It was a relatively quiet neighborhood, and the only sounds that reached her ears were the faint laughs of a few kids playing at some far-off playground. As his apartment loomed into view, she dreaded what she would find inside. Would it look like the place had been upturned in a fit of rage? Like he couldn't take it anymore? Or would there maybe be signs of restraint? A method to the madness? She had no idea what to expect, but as she approached his front door, she couldn't stop a silent gasp from escaping her lips. There below the doorknob was a streak of fading blue paint, almost invisible against the dark brown of the wooden door panel. She quickly stepped onto his doorstep to further examine the defect. Eyes searching every angle, she hesitated briefly, then lifted her hand to trace 2 fingers along the mark. A part of her was almost expecting to feel something. Perhaps some clue as to what the mark meant, but no such revelation ever came. All she felt was the coarse wood under her fingers. After realizing the door would offer her no more information, she simply frowned and turned away, letting her eyes fall shut. Sniffle. Both of Tsunade's eyes fluttered open as the sound rang through her ears, knocking her out of her stupor. At first, she thought she might have imagined it, but a few seconds later, she heard it once more. The door to the apartment slowly creaked open and Tsunade peered around the edge. One glance revealed a sniffling Sakura sitting at the feet of Naruto's bed and hugging her knees to her chest. She turned towards the doorway looking a little startled at first, but after a moment, she just looked away. Her eyes were red, even more so than the last time Tsunade had seen them. The poor girl was probably devastated hearing Sasuke had left and now the one person who would have been willing to fight to get him back was gone too. Tsunade half smiled then opened the door a bit more. Light crept in through the open slit illuminating a small portion of Sakura's body before Tsunade spoke. "Hey," she whispered. Sakura didn't respond. She just sat there, motionless, and obviously a shell of her former self. The silence between them seemed to be so all-encompassing that Tsunade decided not to move for a while. She just stood in the doorway with the outside light curling around the edges of her body. There were no words. When she felt enough time had passed, she stepped inside and shut the door behind her. It was only now that the outside light was gone that she realized how dark it was. She looked for the light switch and casually flipped it on. The first thing she noticed was that the place was clean. Maybe there was a method to the madness after all. "You shouldn't just sit in the dark by yourself," she said silently. Sakura remained unresponsive. Tsunade frowned then decided it would probably be best if she tried to at least do something to comfort the frail girl sitting a few feet away from her. She could already see the innocence fading away, the childish notion of life being stripped away piece by piece and leaving the harsh reality in its wake. Tsunade imagined it was painful, at least it had been in her experience. One glance at the girl was all it took to see that she was nowhere near ready for any of this. But then again, no one ever really was. Her hair was still such a vibrant pink. Tsunade supposed it was because she hadn't seen the grittier parts of life as she had. The parts of life that change you forever. Maybe that would soon change as well. Her own hair had turned a pale blonde long ago. Tsunade smiled a sad smile then approached with silenced steps. When she was a few inches away, she smiled softly and asked, "Can I sit?" Sakura's shoulders lifted and fell. Tsunade half smiled then sat next to her. The two sat in silence until Tsunade finally felt like it was the right time to speak. So, you heard what happened, huh?
Sakura slowly nodded. Tsunade sighed, then put an arm around her back, shaking her reassuringly. Well, get him back. She was largely unresponsive, but after a while, she said in the simplest voice, I knew something was wrong. She hugged her form tighter before adding in a whisper, he didn't want ramen.
You were with him last night? Yeah, Sakura whispered, we went on a date.
Despite everything, Tsunade smiled. Did you guys have fun? Not really, we just talked about Sasuke. Oh, there was a brief pause before Sakura shut both eyes, trying to hold back tears. It's my fault, she said. I shouldn't have brought up Sasuke. I knew it might make him upset, but I just wanted.
Shush, Tsunade said, hugging her a little tighter. Don't ever say that again. It's not your fault. He made his choice, Sakura. They both did. After a few more sniffles, Sakura whispered, yeah, and they both left me. Tsunade frowned, trying to find the right way to explain what couldn't be explained. Look, Sakura, she said, hesitation apparent in her voice. I am sure it might feel this way, but they didn't do this to hurt you. Right now, they're just lost. I am sure they both still care about you. Sakura shifted around uncomfortably as she replied, Sasuke knocked me out so I couldn't follow him, and Naruto didn't even say goodbye. Tsunade thought about the statement, then sighed, finding herself at a loss for words.
For all intents and purposes, the little girl was right, and she was starting to feel a little annoyed that the two idiots had left her so little to work with. She tried to think of something comforting to say, but it all sounded too cliché, and she suspected it wouldn't help the little girl sitting beside her in any significant way. In the end, she decided it would be best not to say anything. The silence felt more fitting anyway. They sat there for what seemed to be an eternity with neither of them saying a word. The silence was strange but not unwelcome, and it blanketed the room in a way that resembled a traditional blanket. It was heavy and carried a certain warmth with it. The only thing that could have added to the effect was if the lights were still off. Maybe Sakura was onto something earlier.
With nothing else to do, Tsunade found herself glancing around the room panel by panel. The floor was clean, miscellaneous objects were neatly arranged in their proper place, and even the walls looked like they had been touched up a bit. The nagging smell of ramen had even been taken care of. It was very different from what she knew Naruto's room to be before, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. A Naruto who left the village would be a different Naruto in many ways. This was probably just one of many. As time passed, she grew restless, well aware of the fact that they could sit there for the whole day if they wanted to. To be honest, that thought actually sounded slightly appealing. To just sit there with things not feeling quite as bad as they actually were. Having other people around always made it easier to bear a burden. It brought a sense of togetherness, like you weren't struggling alone. But there were downsides as well. Wallowing in self-pity meant nothing would ever get done, which left the question of whether it was really ever a good idea to do so. Tsunade had come to her conclusion long ago. Change required action, not brooding, so she let out a reluctant sigh, deciding it was about time to go. She shifted from her sitting position and prepared to get up, only to feel something rub against her side through the thin cloth of her coat. It took her all of 2 seconds to remember what it was, and when she did, she actually found it in herself to smile a bit. She leaned to the side slightly, then reached into the pockets of her green coat, pulling out a blue notebook with discolored yellow pages. Sakura glanced at it, but it didn't hold her attention long. Tsunade wore a weak smile, then said, I've been carrying this around all day. What is it? Sakura asked. Something Naruto left behind, Tsunade replied, flipping through various doodles and writings. Some of them made her smile and some of them made her frown, but she kept going until she arrived at the note she was looking for. She flattened out the page a couple of times upon reaching it, then held the small book out to Sakura and said, I think He'd want you to read it. Sakura looked at it for a moment, then silently accepted it. She didn't start reading immediately, but when she did, Tsunade could see the emotion creeping into her eyes. Every time her eyes finished flitting through one line, they more quickly skimmed the next. By the time she was done, her eyes carried a certain sadness in them, and even the lifeless exterior she was sporting couldn't hide the raw emotion pouring out of her face. She stared at the scratchy writing for a while longer before whispering, I never knew he felt this way. Tsunade gave a slow shrug, I don't think anyone did. Sakura frowned, eyeing the note sadly, but why didn't he say anything? He said it all there, Sakura, he thought he could take care of himself. Sakura thought about the answer and a few seconds later, her frown deepened as she looked away. Guess he was wrong. Yeah, Tsunade said. I guess so. After another span of silence, Sakura asked, do you believe him? Believe him? He said, head come back. Tsunade tightened her grip on the little girl's shoulder. Don't worry, Sakura, we're already working on it, he'll be back. What about Sasuke? She asked. Well, get him back too, Tsunade replied. Okay. There was a moment's pause, but in the end, she replied with a small nod, and although it was barely visible, there was the slightest of smiles there too. Tsunade was glad to see that she was at least trying. Maybe there was some hope after all. Tsunade smiled, then rose to her feet and stretched with both arms over her head. Letting out an awkward groan that sounded like a cross between a monkey and a banshee, it was mainly meant to make Sakura laugh, and she was very pleased when the little girl's smile widened, not the full effect intended, but something, nonetheless. A little laughter could hurt at a time like this. She let her arms fall to her sides, then said, all right, Sakura, I am gonna be needing that now, nodding towards the small notebook. Sakura handed it back to her gently, although it seemed a part of her didn't want to let go. Tsunade accepted it graciously, making an intentional effort to cup one hand over the hand Sakura had used to give the book back. She quickly pulled the little girl onto her feet and brushed off her shoulders. She looked at her from head to toe, then decided to pass a few fingers through the now messy pink hair. The girl should look at least somewhat presentable before they returned to society. At last, she curled her index finger and tapped the bottom of her chin twice, whispering, be strong.
Sakura looked down shyly but responded with a small nod, and chin up. Tsunade added, now, come on, let's get out of here. Sakura nodded, then gathered herself and followed Tsunade towards the door. As they approached the front door, Tsunade reached for the light switch once more but stopped when she noticed a broken alarm clock and picture frame resting on Naruto's nightstand. She stopped in her tracks, realizing that it was very possible that she didn't have the full picture before. Maybe there was some madness before the method. She examined both items meticulously. The alarm clock was foreign to her, but the picture frame wasn't. It was resting face down, but she knew the picture underneath full well. It was the picture of Team 7 from so long ago, back when they were actually a team, although a part of her now wondered if there was ever really a time like that. Tsunade reached for the oh-so-familiar picture but stopped short when she noticed Sakura turn away. She paused momentarily, then gave a soft smile and said, if you don't want to see it, we don't have to look. Sakura remained silent but kept her gaze pointed in the other direction. Tsunade gave an understanding smile, then opened the door. Okay, we won't look. Sakura walked outside and Tsunade followed behind her, shutting the lights off as they both found their way back into the world. It was hot out, hot and humid, and it was getting to the point where Naruto felt like even his sweat balls had sweat balls. It wasn't anything too different from what he had experienced on his travels with Team 7. But that didn't make it any more enjoyable. The heat had a way of just becoming plain old unbearable. Even if you barely had any clothes on, heck, all he had on was a pair of shorts and he was still melting faster than a popsicle on a hot summer day. And it definitely didn't make the search for food any easier. So far, he hadn't had any luck. No matter how many bushes he rustled through, no matter how many trees he looked on, and no matter how meticulously he searched, he found nothing. No berries, no fruits, no nuts, no anything. If he couldn't find anything soon, he'd have to resort to eating some random insect like they taught him in survival class. Gross. In the distance, he could hear the faint buzzing of some insects. The continuous droning sound let him know they were bees. His first instinct told him it would be best not to stumble onto them. But another part of him wondered if it was worth running into them if it meant tasting some of that oh-so-wonderful honey. Before long he was looking out into the distance, fantasizing about yellow gooey goodness. Yellow, gooey, tasty, honey. It almost made his mouth water. That is until he remembered he'd have to endure a world of pain to get it. He had experienced a few run-ins with bees before and they weren't pleasant. He had learned his lesson, so he shook himself out of it and let out a deflated sigh. Sadly, he turned his gaze to a bluish, black beetle that he had spotted crawling through a few sticks in the ground. He sighed in disappointment before squatting low to the ground so he and the beetle were only a few inches away from each other. Looks like it's just you and me. The beetle stopped in its tracks, slowly turning around to face him. There was some semblance of a stare down, and the beetle fluttered its heavy wings as Naruto squinted. He knew what needed to be done. "Just want you to know," he began, lifting both hands and wiggling his fingers, "this isn't personal." He finished, lunging at the beetle's perching spot with a crazed shout. The beetle evaded him with a simple flap of its wings and took to the skies, fluttering away from the scene of the attempted murder. "Hey!" Naruto yelled. "Get back here, you little!" He reached out to snatch the beetle from the sky and missed poorly, losing his balance in the process. An unsteady woe echoed through the forest as he lost his footing, tumbling awkwardly into the ground and whirling a puff of leaves into the air. "Ow!" he said, eventually lifting a hand to massage the back of his head. As the leaves fluttered to the floor, he let out a groan and forced himself upright. After regaining his bearings, he looked to his left, then to his right, then straight out in front of him. It took him less than 5 seconds to realize the beetle was nowhere to be found. He let out a silent groan, leaning against the tree trunk he had fallen next to. "The great Naruto Uzumaki," he grumbled, defeated by a beetle. "Maybe you're just not cut out for this," Kurama mumbled. "Thanks, Kurama, that's exactly what I wanted to hear." "Well, I wouldn't lie to you, remember." Yeah, shut up," Naruto mumbled as his eyes lazily scanned the environment. Stupid dirt, stupid rocks, stupid bushes, stupid trees, why were they there anyway? They didn't have any fruits on them. He pulled a face, then braced himself to get up, but it was in that moment that he realized his salvation was resting right under his hands. The weird texture under his fingers drew his attention, and when he saw what he was sitting next to, he almost did a somersault in joy. There on the ground was a tiny blackish-purple mushroom. His singular eye zipped over to the mushroom until it was less than an inch from the small sprout. His frantic eye scrutinized it for a few seconds before he quickly popped onto his feet. A quick survey of the area surrounding the tree trunk revealed a whole family of shrooms, all different shapes and sizes. His eyes sparkled in glee as he threw both fists into the air. "I am saved. Yuppie. I am not letting you spoil this for me, Kurama." He quickly knelt down and plucked a particularly big one from the bunch. "Oh, ho ho," he laughed, eyes turning beady as he brought the shroom up to his gaze. "You're gonna hold me until I can get my ramen. You sure that's good to eat?" Kurama echoed from his chamber. Naruto shrugged like he didn't have a care in the world. "Looks fine to me. It's a little smelly, but I think all mushrooms are like that." "Well, maybe you should munch." Naruto gave a cheeky smile and said, "Too late," chewing happily before swallowing the mushroom in question and simultaneously grabbing for another one. Kurama sighed. "Suit yourself. Chill out, Kurama, it was out in the wild, it was bound to smell a little funky." Hey," Naruto said, grabbing a handful of shrooms and shoving them into his pouch. "Be a stubborn furball if you want, but I am taking some of this stuff back to camp. It's no Ichiraku's, but it's good enough to hold me till tonight." "Yeah, you do that," Kurama murmured. "HMPH, I will," Naruto retorted. Naruto headed back to his campsite with an undeniable pep in his step. He had found the food he was so desperately in need of, and now he had the fuel to keep traveling until nightfall. Definitely a win. As he arrived back at the campsite, he walked over to the branch his clothes were drying on and lifted a hand to check if they were dry. He could still feel some moisture under his fingertips, but he suspected they would be fully dry soon. Until then, he'd just have to wait. He dropped down to the base of the same tree trunk from earlier and let out a content sigh. Safe in the knowledge that he'd be able to cook some of his precious ramen later. The thought itself was enough to make his mouth water. And he could feel his body fall slack as he stared out into space, fantasizing about slurpy noodles and tasty pork. His hungry gaze lingered on a random tree until he noticed what he was doing. With a violent shake of his head, he chased the thoughts away and raised an arm to wipe a bit of saliva from his lip. Soon after, he cleared his throat and looked around suspiciously. Out here in the middle of nowhere, there was probably no one watching, but it was just one of those moments where you had to make sure. Nobody wanted to be the weird kid drooling while looking out into the distance. When he was confident he was alone, he let his body fall more at ease and looked around at the surrounding environment. There wasn't much to do, so he tried to find things he thought were interesting. There wasn't much to hold his attention though. Most of the trees looked the same, the rocks were no different, and the stream had lost its appeal a while ago. Overall, the environment just looked boring, or maybe old was a more accurate way of putting it. It was full of life when he first got there, but it had lost some of its luster. He knew he was getting really bored when he had to cover a tired yawn. "All right," he exclaimed, accepting the fact that waiting around and doing nothing could never be his style. Time to pop into Kurama's chamber and see what he was up to. The sound of a singular drip echoed through the chamber as Naruto arrived, once again standing in the puddle of water. One look through the iron bars revealed Kurama's calm figure resting with his eyes closed and his head on his paws. His body slowly moved up and down as he took in monstrous breath after monstrous breath, rippling the water beneath his nose. The sight was becoming more and more familiar. "Lazy boons," Naruto called from behind the iron bars, gripping two of them and shaking them semi-violently. A low grumble was heard before one of Kurama's eyes slowly opened. Naruto plopped down into a seated position opposite the iron bars and asked, "Why are you so quiet all the time?" Kurama's eye fell closed again. "I am used to the quiet." "You're used to it?" Naruto asked, tilting his head. Kurama sighed as he shifted around in the chamber. "You're not the first person I've lived in, kid. The people before you weren't as chatty." "Oh," Naruto said, slightly confused. "So, is that a bad thing?" "I am starting to think it wasn't." "Hee hee," Naruto laughed. "Come on, Kurama, I am not that annoying." "You'd be surprised." "Ah, phooey," Naruto said, waving a hand dismissively. "You'd probably be annoyed no matter what I did." "Probably." Naruto smiled. "Well, you're stuck with me, so get used to it." "I am trying, believe me." Naruto grinned and tried to think of a way to keep the conversation going. Despite their differences, he had learned that Kurama was at least someone he could talk to. Maybe he hadn't learned that earlier because he had never tried before, but it was a welcome change, and it made running away a whole lot easier since he was never really alone, even if Kurama's replies were lazier than Shikamaru's. His face scrunched up as he tried to think of something to talk about. But he drew a blank, at least on any small talk. The only thing that came to mind was a question he had been pondering since the day he left. It was one of many questions that he was trying to avoid bringing up until they had put a little more distance between them and Konoha. But with nothing else to do, he abandoned his former plan and decided it couldn't hurt to ask since they had some time to kill. Kurama owed him some answers anyway. "Hey, Kurama," he began. What did you mean when you said you got trapped in me?" Kurama paused briefly, then opened both eyes as he turned towards Naruto. The movement of his body sent rows of ripples through the water. "Guess it's time for some of those answers, huh?" "We've got some time to kill," Naruto replied. "I guess we do." There was a brief silence before Naruto nodded for Kurama to go ahead. Kurama once again relaxed his head on his paws as he began. "There was a time when I was free to roam the earth." "Really?" Naruto said, eyes filling with curiosity. "Yeah, really. Then how'd you become this?" "Become what?" Naruto shrugged. "A fox that gets locked up in people, I guess." "Simple," Kurama replied. "People are afraid of me." "Oh," Naruto said, eyes dropping a bit. "That sucks." There was a slight pause as Kurama's single visible eye focused on Naruto. Soon after, something of a huff was heard as he spoke from behind the bars. "Don't say that like I need your pity, they should be afraid of me." Naruto looked at Kurama contemplatively then shrugged again. "Well, you don't seem that bad to me." Kurama scoffed. "We've been on speaking terms for less than a day, kid, so don't act like you know me, and don't act like you know what I've done. You can't know, you can only guess, and don't mistake my helping you for anything more than it is." "Well, what is it?" Naruto asked, voice barely audible. "I am in this because I'll be able to get back at Konoha and have some fun along the way, that's it." Naruto paused then let out a silent, "Oh," scratching his head as he looked towards the ground. A few moments later, he lifted his head, asking, "Well, we're still friends, right?" A low sigh escaped Kurama's throat as his eyes fell shut. "I don't have friends, kid." Naruto paused briefly then looked away with a somewhat sad smile. "Yeah," he whispered, falling back on one of those fake smiles he had mastered so well. "I guess you're right." Kurama's single visible eye opened slightly, watching the boy through the familiar darkness. An annoyed groan could be heard shortly after, followed by some uncomfortable shifting around, and finally a voice lower than a whisper. "We're acquaintances." There was a short pause as Naruto registered what Kurama had said, but when he did, his pearly whites came into full view. A real smile this time. "Well, That's not too bad, he chirped back, rubbing one finger under his nose. Think we'll become friends one day? Who knows? Kurama mumbled, it's the wrong question anyway. Huh, weren't you asking about how you became a Jinchuriki? Oh, yeah, Naruto mused, lowering his hand to his chin. What about that? Well, the man who sealed me away, Kurama said, pausing briefly, was your father. An awkward silence echoed through the chamber for an inordinate amount of time, and when Naruto finally found it in himself to speak again, his voice was barely audible. What? Yeah, Kurama replied, same day you were born actually. Naruto's lip hung precariously from his mouth as he felt his body turn to lead. In the background, he heard faint echoes of Kurama explaining further, but the words no longer registered. The world was spinning too fast for them to. His whole life had crafted this perfect picture of his parents in his mind. No one had ever told him about them, so he had simply gone with his imagination. He told himself they had a good reason for not being around, and he even imagined he knew what they were like. His mother was loving and caring and kind, strict when she needed to be but loving through it all. She would berate him about his poor appetite but also make him a hearty breakfast and kiss him goodnight. His father was all of that and more. Brave, strong, powerful, an S-rank ninja with cool hair like Kakashi's, and definitely an awesome father. There was no question that was what he was, what they were, they had to be. You're lying, he said, cutting off Kurama mid-sentence. Kurama paused, then squinted. Why would I do that? My father would never do that to me. Oh, I see, Kurama replied, staring at the small boy with slight intrigue. After a while, he simply cracked his neck and continued. Sorry, kid, but you don't know what type of man your father was. Well, I like to think that I did, Naruto said, his voice coming out much louder than intended. Kurama stared at him for a moment longer, then shut both eyes with a snort. Whatever, kid. Silence consumed the chamber after that, so much so that the only sounds heard were those of Naruto's quickened breaths floating through the air. After composing himself somewhat, Naruto let out a sniffle and said, he wouldn't do that to me. Kurama remained silent, lying down in his usual position with his head turned away from the bars. Naruto could feel himself gulp involuntarily as he continued, fine, why would he do that to me? Kurama didn't turn to face him, he simply gave a shrug of his broad shoulders. Naruto looked at him for what felt like an eternity as he fought the tears beginning to rest at the bottom of his eyes. When the eternity had passed, he looked away, firmly whispering, I don't believe you. Kurama sighed, forcing himself to get up and turn towards Naruto, a single paw lifted to cover the board, yawn escaping his blackened lips as he replied, you don't have to. Naruto's response nearly came out as a growl, you told me you had answers but all you have are lies. Watch your tone, Kurama said, red eyes narrowing in the dark, I have answers, you just don't like them. Naruto stood in the vast expanse of water trying his best to hold back tears. At the moment, he was failing, and it only got worse when he realized he had no reply to what the fox had said. He wasn't there when it all happened, so how could he? He was simply stuck standing there with no reply, no way of defending his imagined reality. With a grunt, he cut the connection he had been maintaining and returned to the real world unapologetically. Stupid fox. There are no answers that way, Naruto. Naruto crossed his arms and gazed out into the forest, determined to block out the noise. You know I am right. Shut up, he finally said. No. Naruto could feel his teeth grinding against each other as he replied, you shut up or I swear ill. Or you'll do what? Pout, throw a fit, and run away. Newsflash, I am living inside you, you can't run from me. Naruto let out an angry growl, then jumped up from his seated position, yanking his clothes from the branch they had been resting on. The little drops of water sent flying to the ground showed they were still a little wet, but he didn't care. It was about time he got moving again anyway. His jacket quickly found its way across his shoulders, and it wasn't long before he was ready to set out again. He didn't need that overgrown orange furball anyhow. He reached into his ninja pouch, pulling out the map he had packed and started looking it over. His visage grew more frustrated when he realized he had no idea which direction to go. He knew he was supposed to be headed towards the hot water village, but now that he had stopped at random, he had no idea what direction that was, and where was he on the map anyway. An annoyed squint showed his frustration, and it wasn't long before his fingers were creating unnaturally large wrinkles in the thin paper. He just couldn't think straight anymore. That stupid fox had said so many stupid things that his focus was completely gone. Now, whenever he tried to think about anything else, his mind would come back to that stupid lie. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Having trouble reading. A familiar voice purred. No, Naruto said through gritted teeth. A moment later, he silently added, the little blue lines are streams. A small snort was heard. Well, what about all the other little lines? There, figure outable, now leave me alone. Hee hee, the fox chuckled, you're hopeless, kid. I am not hopeless, Naruto said, staring at the map and trying to will it into showing him what he needed to know. His stubborn leer was interrupted when he heard a very distinct sound come from a nearby brush. Snap! Naruto's head spun towards the brush the sound had come from, and he could feel his heart skip a beat in the process. The sound was followed by nothing but silence, and the dark green leaves looked as if they had never been disturbed. They simply swayed back and forth in the gentle breeze. He had been in situations like this before with Team 7. So hearing random sounds wasn't completely uncharted territory. But he did have to admit it was a lot more nerve-wracking since he was alone. Sometimes they would just be minding their own business and out of nowhere, a twig would snap, or a tree branch would creak, or some other random sound would be heard, all telltale signs that something might be up. Most times it was nothing, just a stray hair running through a brush, or a bird perching in its nest, but there were other times when the nothing was most definitely something. Naruto's eyes flitted through his surroundings as he tried to sense out any lurking dangers. Nothing so far. The forest seemed darker now as opposed to the vibrance it exhibited earlier. Greens appeared muted and could be mistaken for light browns at first glance. The light of the sun barely broke through the trees overhead, and the breeze that was so refreshing in the heat was nothing short of bone-chilling now. Naruto turned back towards the mess of leaves, then decided that whatever threat may be out there was probably worth overlooking his disagreements with the fox. At least for now, his thoughts were simple and brief. You heard that too, right? Louder than you did. Naruto squinted towards the brush, placing the map back in his pouch and pulling out a kunai. The mess of dark green leaves grew more ominous with each passing second, and he could feel his breaths getting shakier and shakier. I am starting to feel a lot like that beetle from earlier, he finally mused, trying to relieve some of the tension. Don't panic, Kurama said, just stop and listen. Okay. What do you hear? Nothing. What? Is that a good thing? Not even close, Kurama replied. Where are the birds? The leaves. Naruto listened harder as his eyes once again scanned the surroundings flittingly. He soon discovered that Kurama was right. The sounds of the forest were all but gone. No birds chirping, no leaves rustling, no life. He sensed it just a split second too late, but that was all the enemy needed to make their move. In one fell swoop, he felt as if his throat had been cut in two. Something of a choked yell escaped his throat as he felt every ounce of air leave his body. He tried to use his hands to relieve the pressure but ended up losing his grip on his kunai instead, sending it spiraling into the ground. The weight crushing his windpipe was heavy, so heavy that he was starting to feel a little out of it. His eyes turned towards the sky as the lack of oxygen sent the world into a spin. Soon after, the darkness started to set in, slowly creeping in from the corners. It wasn't long before it completely covered him. Naruto could barely feel his eyelids fluttering open as he let out a silent groan. A small part of him wanted to fall back into unconsciousness because his head was throbbing, but it was too late now. His surroundings were already starting to blur into view, so going back to sleep probably wasn't an option. What he really needed to do was figure out what the heck had happened. One moment he was minding his own business, the next he had been ambushed so hard he thought he might be dead. Tiredly, he lifted his eyes to look out in front of him. His vision was still a little iffy, but he could see well enough to make out the dark greens of the forest. Overhead, tree leaves rustled softly, and on the ground, small bushes dotted the landscape. As he became more aware of his surroundings, he noticed that the whole forest had turned into a collage of blacks and whites again. Was it night already? The sound of crickets chirping in the distance let him know that it was. Another groan escaped his lips as he tried to shift around where he was sitting. He found his movements were much more limited than he would have liked, and when he looked down, he saw the reason why. A band of thicker than usual ropes had been fastened around his upper body and were strapping him to the tree behind him. And on top of that, they seemed to have some type of seal on them. Not good. He turned his focus back to the area in front of him and noticed there was a small campfire a few feet away. The orange flames sent small embers his way and he could feel some of the heat radiating onto his body as it chased away the night chill. It was a small mercy from whoever had taken him captive. Finally awake, huh? Kurama's voice wasn't particularly nice on the ears, but Naruto couldn't deny being happy to hear it for once. What the heck happened? He groaned. We were ambushed. Yeah, Naruto replied. I got that. Any idea who? Maybe, Kurama mused. Feels similar to those chakras from earlier, but I can't be sure. There's a group of them talking in the distance though. Naruto looked ahead then squinted, making a concentrated effort to peer past the dancing flames. His vision was still blurring into focus, but he could see well enough to see that Kurama was right. Sure enough, as he looked past the fire, he could see 4 figures standing a distance away, veiled in shadows, 3 guys and 1 girl from the looks of it. He could see their mouths moving but there was no way he'd be able to make out what they were saying from where he was. He let out a silent grunt of frustration, but his moping was cut short when Kurama broke into his thoughts. Always remember the resources you have at your disposal. Naruto squinted in confusion but caught on when he felt an imperceptible amount of chakra bubbling around his ears. Oh, now he got it. Good call, he replied, biting his lip while squinting at the group in question. All it took for him to listen in was a tilt of his head. We were making good time before, the girl said, now we're just wasting it. If we don't get Sasuke to Orochimaru in time, I am not going to be the one to explain this little detour. Look, we couldn't just ignore him, one of the guys replied. You felt that chakra same as I did, he could have been a threat. We still didn't have to get involved. She spat, he was heading away from us. Yeah, that's what we thought about those other guys, and we were wrong. Naruto's eavesdropping was cut short when he heard a familiar voice coming from above him. They're trying to figure out what to do with you. Naruto's eyes widened. That voice, there was no way. Naruto looked up above and saw none other than Sasuke Uchiha sitting on a tree branch, lurking in the shadows. Sasuke. The boy in question was tossing a rock up and down carelessly and seemed unfazed by the mention of his name. We sensed you earlier, he said. I didn't think it was you though. It didn't make sense. After all, he caught the rock one final time as he looked down. What are you doing out here all alone? What am I doing here? Naruto half growled. What are you doing here? Sasuke's eyes narrowed. I asked first. Naruto tried staring back, but it was obvious Sasuke wasn't gonna budge. Probably because he didn't have to. He wasn't the one tied to a tree after all. Naruto frowned. Those stupid pitch black eyes never got any more fun to look at. With a grunt, he turned away and silently grumbled, I left. What do you mean you left? What are you deaf? I said I left. All on your own. Well, yeah, Naruto mumbled, fidgeting in the ropes, sort of. Sasuke said, pausing briefly as he took a moment to register the information. Why? A moment passed before Naruto gave a small shrug. I got tired of people always treating me like crap and looking down on me, so I decided I was gonna change that. By leaving. Well, I am not leaving so I can sit around and do nothing, Naruto droned. I am gonna train. With who? What's it to you? Naruto retorted, voice coming out a bit louder than intended. Sasuke looked down at Naruto but said nothing else, instead choosing to return to his rock tossing. I doubt you'll get very far, but whatever, he finally said. A moment later, he added, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised you left though, especially since I did the same thing. Naruto could feel the blood drain from his face after hearing those words. You did what? Sasuke kept tossing his rock and said no more. You left Konoha? Naruto asked, eyes wide in disbelief. Now you're the deaf one, Sasuke said nonchalantly. But why? Naruto asked, wriggling around in the ropes. It's actually quite simple, Sasuke replied, lips set in a grim line. There's something I need, and I can't get it in Konoha. Naruto could feel a chill run through his body as Sakura's words came flooding back to his mind. Curse mark, anger, power, Orochimaru. He could feel his throat go dry as he looked up towards the shadows. This is what Sakura was talking about, he whispered. You're going to Orochimaru, aren't you? Sasuke tightened his grip on the rock. Yes. You can't be serious, Naruto said, eyes already turning frantic. You're already strong, Sasuke. You don't need to go to that freaky snake guy to get stronger. It doesn't matter how strong I am unless I am stronger than Itachi. and right now, I am not. If Orochimaru is the only way that can happen, then my path is clear. But why can't you stay in Konoha and get stronger? Don't act stupid, Naruto, Sasuke snapped. You were there when it happened. I gave it everything I had and Itachi tossed me across the room like I was a piece of garbage. All of my training was useless and the only thing I learned that day was that I was still nothing compared to him. His eyes narrowed as he continued. I haven't been doing enough, but that's gonna change, he finished, simultaneously returning to his rock tossing. Come on, Sasuke, Naruto pleaded, there's gotta be another way. There actually is, Sasuke replied, at least according to Itachi. Well, then you've gotta take it, Naruto urged. The other way is to kill you. With that one statement came a silence that made the chill of the night feel even colder. Into the awkward silence, Sasuke whispered, not so enthusiastic now, are you? Naruto swallowed a bit before snapping himself out of it, kill me. Don't worry, Sasuke said, as you can see, I've chosen the former. I don't like the idea of getting strong enough to kill my brother by becoming him. He finally tossed the rock to the ground and finished, which is why I am gonna let you go. Naruto arched an eyebrow, let me go. Sasuke swung his feet over the tree branch and let them dangle haphazardly. I've already weakened the ropes tying you and tampered with the seal. If you were to break out, it would look like whoever tied you up did a bad job. This is your only chance, take it, or leave it. Kurama wasted no time in making his opinion known. One word of advice, kid, run. And just leave Sasuke to go to some freaky snake guy. Aren't you leaving too? Kurama retorted. He made his choice, now stop being a hypocrite and get out of here. But I am not going to a freaky snake guy. I am running out of patience, Sasuke said, pulling Naruto out of his thoughts. I am giving you a chance to escape, don't lose it by being stupid. Hear that? Kurama said. Don't be stupid, you can't beat them 5-on-1. But I can't just leave him here, Naruto replied. That's exactly what you're gonna do, Kurama growled, and where does this misplaced sense of duty come from? You were ready to abandon this idiot 2 seconds ago. I was leaving him in Konoha, not with some freaky snake guy. Kurama chuckled in disbelief. Listen, kid, if you fight them, what do you think is gonna happen? This isn't gonna be like one of those cool fights where you magically take them all on. In a fight like this, there's no Jinchuriki, there's the ninja who lives and the ninja who dies. Fighting should be your last resort here. But aren't you supposed to be this overpowered creature or something? It doesn't matter, Kurama stated. We don't know how strong these guys are and you're not trained enough when it comes to using my powers. Sasuke alone would be a problem with his Sharingan. What's it gonna be, Naruto? Sasuke's voice was cold but demanding as usual. His body remained hunched over on the tree branch as he finished. I am tired of waiting. Look, Naruto said, a stubborn pout on his face. Let's just fight them together and go back. Sasuke's eyes narrowed through the shadows. You would go back so soon after leaving? If it meant saving your sorry butt, yeah. Sasuke huffed. You lack conviction. I don't. Now, take my offer or leave it. I am not gonna tell you again. Naruto could feel his teeth grinding against each other as he weighed his options. True, 5-on-1 odds weren't all that great, but Sasuke was about to go to freakin' Orochimaru. There was no way he could just stand by and let that happen. Especially not when Sakura had warned him about this craziness. He'd have to try something and hope to beat the odds like he usually did. He always found a way, right? Maybe a few shadow clones would even out the odds, or even better, tip them in his favor. That sounded like a neat idea, especially if Kurama was gonna just sit back and be useless. Yeah, it would just all work itself out, he hoped. From the confines of his chamber, Kurama shook his head disapprovingly. Kid, just leave, don't do this. It was pointless, however, seeing as Naruto's mind had already been made up. I am going for it. Idiot. A faint creaking sound was heard for a split second before a loud snap resonated through the forest. The weakened seal exploded in a flash of smoke and soot and, in the chaos, Naruto made his move. He quickly lifted both hands to form the sign for his shadow clones, but his fingers never met, for his arms had long been knocked away by a kick from Sasuke, who was now firmly planted on the ground. His Sharingan had already spun into action and even through the clouds of smoke, The blood-red dojutsu flared with life. That, he sighed, was a mistake. Naruto scowled as he dropped back a few steps. Sasuke always was a stubborn bastard. He quickly stretched out his right hand and within seconds the billowing smoke started swirling around it. It wasn't long before he had a swirling ball of blue, brown, and white rotating in his palm. Sasuke looked at the attack with mild intrigue but made no movement, although a faint trace of electricity could be seen flickering around his hand. Fine, Naruto thought, if you're gonna give me a shot, I am taking it. He launched himself into a sprint, preparing to launch his attack, but before he could take 2 steps, he felt 3 stakes jam themselves into his forearm in rapid succession. Arg! He grunted, Rasengan spinning out of control and dispersing into the night. Pain racked his arm as he turned it over to see blood oozing from 3 golden stakes that were inches deep into his arm. He grimaced in pain as the stakes seemed to harden even more, lodging themselves further into his arm. Damn it. That meant the other fighters were already getting involved. He started spinning around to face his new attacker, but before he could even prepare himself, he felt his knee bend in a direction that he knew no knee should ever bend in. Crack. Ah. His body fell to the ground with a thud, and if how he gripped at his knee was any indication, he was in a world of pain. What the hell, Jirobo? The girl yelled. You didn't tie him up right. The heavy-set nin simply looked on cluelessly. You should know never to trust Jirobo, one man purred from the midst of the group. I am surprised he didn't eat the ropes. Shut up, Sakin, the girl snapped. Geez, can't trust anyone but myself out here. She walked over to Naruto's curled-up body, then pulled a face and said, looks like you're a fighter, huh? I'll say, one 8-limbed guy said, walking up casually. He had some type of spinning ball in his right hand, looked pretty nasty. The girl mused, if that's the case, maybe he'd be useful to Orochimaru. The 8-limbed man shrugged, crossing all 6 arms, maybe you're onto something. Naruto could feel the world spinning as the conversation blurred into the background. The lightheaded sensation was back in full force now, and it felt even worse than before if that was possible. With each passing second, the words grew fainter, slowly fading towards nothingness. With a grunt, he shut his eyes, resolving himself to do something before the words could disappear completely. Drip. The familiar sound let Naruto know he had indeed succeeded in his goal, even if only by the skin of his teeth. He was in front of the gate to Kurama's chamber once more. Despite the pain, he tried to offer up some form of coherent thought. His attempts were largely unsuccessful though, and, in the end, the only thing to escape his lips was a pained groan. I tried to warn you, Kurama drawled. There was no reply on Naruto's end. Now you're stuck writhing in pain with a broken leg and a messed up arm. Sucks, doesn't it? I had to try, Naruto rasped in between shaky breaths. No. You didn't. I had no choice, Naruto heaved. You could have chosen to listen to me, Kurama said, but you didn't, and now you're gonna pay for it. Naruto heaved a few more heavy breaths before saying, come on, stop messing around and help me like you usually do. Oh, Kurama grinned, so, you didn't listen to me, but now you want my help. Well, you wouldn't listen to me first, Naruto retorted, so I had to try by myself. Kurama huffed, shaking his head disapprovingly, and you still haven't learned. I am not helping you. What do you mean you're not helping me? Naruto replied, breaths coming in shorter spurts. Kurama's red eyes narrowed through the dark as he spoke. You ignored my advice and got yourself in this mess. Get yourself out of it. With that, he turned away, returning to his usual position with his head on his paws. Kurama, Naruto called, wincing in pain. There was no answer. Kurama. He yelled, you gotta help me. No, I actually don't. Sue, the 8-limbed man said, we're taking him back to Orochimaru's then. What do you think, doofus? Chiyuya, do you really always have to be such a tool? Grow a spine, Hito, and Fatso, pick up the trash, it's your fault he escaped anyway. Whatever, Jirobo said, and don't let him escape again, Kidomaru said. I don't know what that thing he had in his hand was, but it didn't look like good news. Yeah, Chiyuya echoed, I don't care what you do, just make sure he's actually secure this time. Well, what should I do? Jirobo questioned, break his legs or something. Chiyuya deadpanned, I just said I don't care, you moron, we're low on time and we've gotta get moving. She pointed a thumb at Sasuke and said, "He should have had his mind awakening pill hours ago, we've been running into too many interruptions." All right, Jirobo said, resigning himself and turning towards his assignment. Naruto lay on the ground, struggling to maintain consciousness as the giant Jirobo stepped closer and closer, every step shaking the ground more than the one before it. Naruto could feel his breath catch in his throat as each step sounded louder and louder. Did he say he was gonna break his legs? What? One bum leg wasn't bad enough. Kurama, he pleaded, you gotta help me. I already told you I am not helping you, now stop talking to me. But you have to, Naruto croaked, grimacing in pain, you're all I've got. Kurama shifted slightly, watching his reflection as it danced in the ripples. He couldn't deny a small part of him feeling something. Where it came from, he had no idea, but he didn't much care. A larger part of him felt indifferent, so he figured he'd just roll with that. Why should he help the stupid kid anyway? He was an idiot who always thought he knew best. Now he just knew what it felt like to pay for it. He didn't owe him anything. By now, Jirobo loomed over Naruto, casting a shadow twice his size, and just as menacing. I've gotta make sure you don't escape again, he said. It's nothing personal. Sweat racked Naruto's body as he looked up at the orange-haired giant, preparing himself for the worst. He closed his eyes, anticipating the pain, but it never came. He chanced another glance at the mohawk-clad giant only to see him gently pulling a candy bar out of his clothing and hiding it from the others using his body. A little snack first, he whispered. Come on, Naruto said, voice coming out shaky, I need you to help me. Kurama lay unresponsive, his lazy frame moving up and down with each breath. Look, Naruto yelled, squeezing his eyes shut to blink away beads of moisture. I know I am an idiot sometimes, and I know I can be annoying, but you can't give up on me yet. We're supposed to be in this together. Except for when you want to do things your way. Kurama snapped back, spinning around in his cage. At those words, Naruto froze, eventually looking away in shame. You say we're in this together, Kurama continued, but that's only when it's convenient for you. Where was all of your team spirit when I told you we should just leave? Naruto sat where he was and didn't respond, instead opting to keep his head bowed and remain silent. That's what I thought, Kurama said, turning away and returning to his prior position with his tails curled around his body. There was a brief span of silence before Naruto spoke again. I am sorry I didn't listen to you. Kurama's body made no movement, but there was a slight twitch in his ears. I was wrong, Naruto said, eyes glued to the water, and next time, he continued, things will be different, but Kurama, if you don't help me now, there's not gonna be a next time, and this adventure is gonna be over before it even starts. Kurama let his eyes roam back to the water beneath him as he pondered what had been said. For all intents and purposes, the boy was right. This would probably mark the end of their journey if they were captured, especially if Orochimaru found out he had stumbled onto a Jinchuriki of all things. There was no telling what might happen then. Still, that didn't mean he should automatically bail the kid out. After all, he still had his pride to think about. He had been flat out ignored and he was the nine-tailed fox for goodness sake. But at least the kid could admit he was wrong, and he did say it wouldn't happen again. Come on, Naruto begged, be my friend. Kurama looked away with his tails absent-mindedly flipping in the background. One brief pause and an annoyed growl later, he let his eyes fall shut with a sigh. You're an idiot, you know that right? Yeah, Naruto said, grinning through the pain, but you'll help me. I want full control, Kurama said, we're doing this my way. Yeah, Naruto replied, nodding, whatever you say. Then let's do this. A moment later, Naruto let out a cry of agony, gripping both hands to a sharp pain stinging his abdomen. He lifted his shirt to see his spiral tattoo glowing as the symbols started burning a dark reddish color. The seal, he croaked. You gotta let go of some of your control. Naruto shut both eyes, clenching one fist as his breathing started to steady. Slowly, the water in the chamber started rising, the waves increasing in size and ferocity as the offending symbol on Naruto's stomach started to fade. That's it, kid, let go. Stop stuffing your face and take care of him already. Chiyuya yelled, picking up the last of their camping materials. It was just a little snack for the road, Jirobo mumbled, wiping his mouth and tossing the wrinkled candy bar wrapper to the floor. After wiping his hands, He reached down to grab Naruto but stopped short of touching him, instead hovering his hand a few inches over his body. Both of Tayuya's hands fell to her sides. What is it now, Fatso? We've gotta get moving. He looked towards her cluelessly, the kid's burning up. Tayuya stood blank-faced with her lips set in a grim line. She soon walked over angrily and muttered, I swear I have to do everything myself. She reached down to grab Naruto, but when she touched him, all the group heard was a sharp sizzling sound. Ah! She yelled, jerking her hand back quickly. What the hell? Slowly, red bubbles started popping out of every pore of Naruto's body. It's that chakra we sensed before, Kitamura said. It was him. What the heck is up with this kid? Tayuya asked, shaking her burnt finger. Sasuke stood with his Sharingan activated, watching intently. All at once, the red chakra took over Naruto's body, covering every visible inch and then some. This is not normal, Kitamura said. A distorted laugh could be heard leaving Naruto's lips as he growled, how right you are. In an instant, the whiskers lining his face deepened and sharp fangs could be seen growing from the sides of his mouth. Before long, his body was shaking with feral anger and inhuman groans could be heard echoing through the forest. The red chakra bubbled and bubbled until it finally reached its boiling point, completing its transformation into something darker and much more ominous, something unrestrained and bred in chaos. And from that chaos emerged a different being, a being much more sinister. Jirobo, get away from him! Tayuya yelled, taking out two kunai. Kitamura, Saken, get ready. Jirobo did as he was told while Kitamura took a step back with all 6 arms taking a defensive position. There was one final burst of chakra energy before the erratic chakra shifting stopped, followed by a sudden calm. In the absence of the red chakra, the forest grew darker. The burning campfire had long gone out and now the only other source of light had disappeared as well. Despite the darkness, there was one part of Naruto still visible, a part of him that seemed to glow through the dark. Tayuya tightened her grip on her kunai as the blood-red eyes turned to her, the thin slits narrowing into focus. Watch yourselves, she said, a bead of sweat trailing down the side of her face. The group watched on as Naruto's broken body somehow found the strength to stand. His legs still looked bent out of shape, but he didn't look the least bit bothered. He just stood there, unfeeling. Eventually, his breathing slowed, and when it did, he looked down at the disjointed knee and gave it a forceful tug. Snap. Ah, he sighed, now that's better. Okay, that's enough of that, Saken said, walking up in stride. I'll take care of this trash. Will you now? Kurama grinned. In a flash of red, a massive chakra arm swung towards the group. The tidal wave of wind that followed shook the trees, the grass, and everything in between. Sasuke only dodged because of his Sharingan. Tayuya tried to block the swipe and largely failed. Jirobo's massive size protected him from any serious damage. Kitamaru's numerous arms shielded him, and Saken was left with a pile of blood oozing from the 3 claw marks in his chest. Have fun taking care of that, Kurama said. A wicked grin stretched from one side of his face to the other. With inhuman speed, he leapt up to a tree branch and darted off into the forest. Sasuke was the only one with eyes fast enough to see him leave. Under a pile of rubble and soot, a band of 6 arms emerged trying to free the body caught beneath. From the bottom of a tree trunk, a giant tried to rise only to stumble over again, and from a puddle of mud, a girl struggled to rise to her feet as her arms shook uncontrollably. Tayuya looked at the gash running down her arm, then gripped at it to try to stop the bleeding. She heaved heavy breath after heavy breath as she turned to Sasuke. Where is he? She asked. Gone, Sasuke said simply, and if we don't do something, he will be too. Tayuya looked to where Sasuke had nodded and saw Saken bleeding from 3 claw marks deep in his chest, his face contorted into a picture of pain and horror. After getting over the shock of the sight, she knelt beside him and reached into her pouch, taking out some gauze and trying to find some way to cover all 3 of the wounds. It was no use though, blood poured out of his body like water and her formerly white gauzes turned blood red within seconds. In the end, she looked away with tear-filled eyes and even bloodier hands. Cocky bastard, she whispered, realizing his pulse was fading. Jiraiya had been following the toad's lead quite well, and he was content to do so until he had caught up to Naruto, but that was before he felt it, a rage as potent as sunshine, shining like a beacon from miles away. His movements halted immediately and even from where he was, the dark chakra sent a chill down his spine. With each passing second, the chakra grew, moving at a speed he had rarely encountered in his many years as a shinobi. "Boss," the frog leader croaked, "you still need us." Jiraiya's eyes narrowed as he looked in the direction the chakra was coming from. Just what the heck was going on? He pondered it for a bit, then snapped himself out of it. "Try to get in contact with any toads we may have in the area that chakra is coming from and tap into my spy network as well. I want to know the moment he stops and where." "You got it. And be discreet," Jiraiya added. "If he thinks something is up, hell, run harder, and with how fast he's moving, we could lose him." "Sure thing, boss." As the band of toads dispersed, Jiraiya took to the trees, his legs almost leaving each branch quicker than they could land. He wasn't sure how long it would take him to reach Naruto from where he was, especially since the kid was moving pretty fast, but it would be a good idea to at least close the gap a bit while he was easy to sense. Not that it mattered all that much anyway, it was only a matter of time before the toads and his spy network gave him a concrete location. With his resources, it was impossible for Naruto to hide forever. Try as he might, his only concern was what might actually be happening at that moment. What type of situation could result in the dark flow of chakra he was feeling now? He had absolutely no idea, and that was what scared him, really scared him, but he had to press on, even if the unknown steadily chipped away at his thoughts. As the full moon faintly illuminated the dirt streets of Konoha, a man appeared at the gates, almost blending in with the darkness of the night. Draped around his body was a black trench coat that stretched down to his knees. And where his black coat ended, his black strapped boots began. Perfectly laced all the way down to the bottom, the coat seemed to fit him perfectly, and his build was about average for a shinobi, although he was slightly taller than most. The final touch was a black pork pie hat with a normal-sized brim. It didn't tilt to the left or to the right, but rather forward, casting a shadow over the top of his face. Below the shadow was a short-trimmed blonde beard, obviously well-shaved and taken care of. As he approached the gate, he turned around, briefly looking out into the forest with mild intrigue. He mused after a moment's pause, scratching his chin a bit. Eventually, he turned away, completing his trek to the gate official. He took off his hat, revealing slicked-back blonde hair that stopped just below his ears before reaching into his coat and pulling out a tied-up scroll. "I've been summoned," he said, voice oily and low. "That for today, thanks for watching."